Good day, everyone. Welcome to Deku Universe. Today we are beginning part 1 of What If Deku Was Trapped Inside Poppy Playtime. The fanfiction is created by Mr. Wonder King 12 on archiveofourown.org. Now let's begin. The rain over Muzutafu that night was the patient kind. Not a storm, just a long gray side the sky seemed to have been holding in for weeks. It beaded on the windows of the maternity ward on the 4th floor of Sonoda General and turned the streetlights below into smears of amber. And it was still falling, soft and steady, at 11:47 p.m. when Izuku Midoriya stopped screaming and started crying instead, because someone had finally put her son into her arms. "There he is," said Nurse Ito, wiping her hands on a towel that had seen better decades. "There's our boy. Good and loud, too. Didn't even wait to be smacked before he started hollering." "He's got excellent lung capacity," Dr. Sonoda agreed, peering over his glasses with the particular fondness of a man who had delivered half the children in this district and never once gotten tired of the moment right after. He was an older man, silver at the temples, hands steady even at 1 in the morning. Healthy color, strong grip. "Look at that. He's already got your finger, Inko." He did. Tiny and furious looking, red-faced from the effort of being born, Izuku Midoriya had wrapped one impossibly small fist around his mother's index finger like he intended never to let go of it again. And then, as if a SWCH had been thrown somewhere behind those scrunched-up eyes, he stopped crying. He blinked up at her, dark eyes, not yet the green they'd settle into, and made a small, questioning sound low in his throat, and then he cooed, actually cooed, a soft bubbling laugh-not laugh that had no business coming from something 4 minutes old. Inko laughed and cried at the same time, which she would later realize was going to become something of a habit where this child was concerned. "Hello," she whispered, so quietly it was really only for him. "Hello, hello, hello. Look at you." She traced one finger along the impossibly soft curve of his cheek, and he turned toward the touch the way flowers turn toward light, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 9 months. Through the fights, through the divorce papers, through the nights she'd fallen asleep on the couch because the apartment felt too big and too quiet for a woman about to have a baby alone. Something in her finally loosened. The chair beside her bed was empty. It had been empty the whole 11 hours. She noticed it, the way you notice a missing tooth with your tongue, an absence you can't stop checking on even though checking never changes anything. Hisashi wasn't coming. He hadn't come to the last 3 appointments either. There had been a time, right after the wedding, when she'd thought his easy laugh and his big promises meant something. And there had been a much longer time after, when she'd learned that a man could love his liquor a great deal more than he loved keeping his word, and that no amount of hoping changed a bottle back into a person. The divorce had gone through 8 months ago. It remained one of the very few decisions in her life she had never once regretted. "You don't need him," she told the baby, and it came out steadier than she expected. "It's just going to be you and me, sweetheart. And I promise you right now, that's going to be enough." Izuku, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by any of this. He yawned an enormous yawn for someone so small, waved one fist in the air like he was already conducting an orchestra, and went back to staring up at his mother with the frank, unblinking fascination that newborns reserve for the one face in the world they've decided, correctly, matters most. "He's a keeper, this one," Nurse Ito said, tucking the blanket a little tighter. "You can already tell. Some babies come out red and furious at the whole business of being born. This one just looks, I don't know, delighted." Dr. Sonoda made a note on his chart, glanced once more at mother and son bathed in the flat fluorescent light, and allowed himself the small, unprofessional luxury of a genuine smile. "Delighted," he repeated. "That's a good word for it. Whatever this one grows up to be, Inko, something tells me he's going to surprise us all." He had no idea, of course, exactly how right he was. For days later they let her take him home, wrapped in a yellow blanket that Inko had knitted herself during the long, lonely evenings of her 3rd trimester. And the rain had finally stopped, and the whole world smelled like it had just been rinsed clean. 2 years slid by in the specific, exhausting blur that seems to happen to every parent of a first child. A blur made of formula and fevers and one truly unforgettable incident involving a jar of pureed carrots and the living room wall. And somewhere in the middle of it, On an ordinary Tuesday evening with the rice cooker steaming on the counter and a basket of unfolded laundry accusing her from the corner of the room, Izuku Midoriya's entire life quietly reorganized itself around a 14-inch television screen. She hadn't meant for him to see it. The evening news had rolled into one of those human interest retrospectives. 5 years since a hero calling himself All Might had made his public debut. And wasn't it remarkable? The anchor was saying how far he'd come. And she'd had it on for background noise while she scrubbed a pot, not paying much attention until she realized the room had gone very quiet, and quiet, where a 2.5-year-old was concerned, generally meant trouble. Izuku was standing 3 inches from the screen. He'd abandoned his blocks entirely. His mouth hung open in an unself-conscious little "oh." And on the screen, grainy old footage showed a colossal golden-haired man in blue standing atop a collapsed building, one enormous fist raised to the sky, more than 100 rescued citizens cheering below him. And he was smiling, not a grim, dutiful smile, but an actual, delighted, ear-splitting grin, like saving 100 lives was the single most fun thing a person could possibly do with an afternoon. "Mama," Izuku breathed, without turning around. "Mama, look, 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 look. I see him, sweetheart." She set down the pot and came to crouch beside him, resting her chin on his small shoulder. "He's smiling." Izuku turned to look at her then, eyes enormous, as if this were the single most important fact ever discovered by science. Everyone's scared, and the building's all broken, and he's smiling, Mama." "Why's he smiling?" Inko considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I think," she said slowly, "he's smiling because he wants everyone else to feel less scared. Like, if he's smiling, maybe it means everything's going to be okay. Heroes do that sometimes. It's part of the job." Izuku turned back to the screen, where the footage looped back to the beginning. The man landing, the dust settling, that same enormous grin breaking across his face like sunrise. His small hands curled into fists at his sides, an expression of fierce, wobbly determination crossing his face that looked deeply strange on someone who still occasionally needed help with his shoes. "I want to do that," he announced. "I want to save everybody. And I want to smile like that too. So they're not scared. Is that so?" "Uh-huh." He nodded so hard his whole body swayed. "I'm going to be a hero, Mama. A real one. And I'm going to smile the whole time so nobody's scared. Even when it's scary for me too." Inko pulled him into her lap, pressed a kiss to the crown of his messy green hair, and did not say any of the things that flickered through her mind in that moment. That heroism was a demanding and dangerous business. That quirks hadn't even manifested in him yet, so there was no way of knowing what he might be capable of. That the vast majority of 2-year-olds who declared themselves future heroes went on to become accountants and bus drivers and perfectly happy ordinary people. She said none of it. She only held him and let him watch the golden man smile through the wreckage for more times before bed, and told herself that whatever he ended up being, she would be proud of him, because he already had the biggest heart she'd ever seen in someone so small. The Park 2 streets overhead a slide shaped like an elephant's trunk and a sandbox that never quite dried out. And it was there, on a bright Sunday morning when Izuku was 3 and a bit, that Katsuki Bakugo decided, with the complete and unshakable authority of a small child, exactly how their game was going to go. "I'm the hero," Katsuki announced, standing on top of the low concrete wall that separated the sandbox from the grass. Hands on his hips, chin jutted forward. "The best hero. Number 1. You gotta be the villain." "Okay," Izuku said instantly, already scrambling to find a suitably villainous stick. "You gotta lose, though. 'Cause I'm gonna beat you, 'cause I'm the strongest." "Okay." Their mothers sat on the bench nearby, with paper cups of vending machine coffee, half watching, half absorbed in their own conversation. Mitsuki Bakugo had a laugh that could probably be heard from orbit, and she used it freely and often, and right now she was using it at something Inko had said about a stain that would not come out of one of Izuku's shirts no matter what she tried. "You're too soft with him," Mitsuki said, not unkindly, watching her son bellow something about dynamite punch and launch himself off the concrete wall at an unresisting Izuku, who obligingly toppled over into the grass with theatrical groans of defeat. "Katsuki, don't actually hit him." "Izuku, sweetheart, are you all right?" "I'm dead." Izuku called cheerfully from the grass, arms and legs splayed out. The villain is dead. The hero won. You're not dead. You're supposed to get back up eventually, Katsuki informed him, standing over him with his small fists still raised. That's how it works. The hero always wins, but the villain doesn't die for real. 'Cause heroes don't kill people, my dad said. Oh. Izuku sat up, considering this new information with real interest. Even really bad villains? Even really bad ones. 'Cause that's the rule. Katsuki plopped down in the grass beside him, some of his bravado deflating now that the audience of mothers had gone back to their coffee. When I get my quirk, I'm going to be way stronger than everybody. Stronger than All Might, probably. Whoa. Izuku's eyes went round. You think you'll be stronger than All Might? Obviously. Katsuki said this the way other children might state that the sky was blue. I'm going to have the best quirk in Japan. Maybe the world. That's so cool, Kakin. There was no envy in it at all. Not even a shadow of it. Just pure, uncomplicated delight at the idea that his best friend might grow up to be the strongest person alive. I bet you will. And I'll help. I'll take notes on all your moves so you know which ones work best, and I'll cheer really loud and... You're weird, Katsuki said, but he was almost smiling when he said it, and he let Izuku lean against his shoulder while they watched clouds drift over the elephant slide. Two small boys who did not yet know that in less than a year, one single doctor's appointment was going to reach into their friendship and rearrange it into something neither of them would recognize. The quirk assessment was scheduled for a Thursday in late spring, at the Tsunoda family clinic, the same modest brick building where Dr. Tsunoda had delivered both boys within 6 weeks of each other 4 years earlier. It was, by unspoken tradition among the neighborhood mothers, something you got through together. And so Inko and Mitsuki sat in the same waiting room, on the same slightly too firm vinyl chairs, while their sons kicked their feet against the chair legs and argued in fierce whispers about who was going first. I want to go first, Katsuki said. You can go first, Kakin. I don't mind. I know I can. I wasn't asking. The nurse called his name a few minutes later, and Mitsuki hauled herself up with her coffee, ruffling her son's hair as they disappeared down the hallway. Izuku swung his feet and hummed to himself and drew little stick-figure heroes on the back of his hand with a pen he'd found in his mother's purse, and Inko watched him do it and felt, without being able to say exactly why, the particular anxious flutter that mothers develop and never quite lose. It was perhaps 11 minutes later. Izuku had counted, out loud, proudly, all the way to 200 and something before losing his place. When the exam room door banged open and Katsuki came barreling out ahead of his mother, both palms crackling and popping with small, furious orange sparks, like a sparkler that hadn't quite figured out its own rhythm yet. Look, he was shouting, loud enough that a nurse at the front desk actually flinched. Look at this. I've got one. I've got the best quirk. I told you. I told you I would. Katsuki, honey, don't point that at the Katsuki. Mitsuki was laughing despite herself, trying and failing to look stern, one hand hovering protectively near a wastebasket that had already caught a small singe mark. It's called explosion, apparently. Sweat's nitroglycerin, if you can believe that. Doctor says with training, he could probably level a city block someday. A city block, Katsuki repeated, delighted beyond words, holding his sparking palms up to Izuku's face like they were the single greatest gift ever bestowed on a 4-year-old. See. I told you. That's amazing, Kakin. And it was. Izuku's whole face had lit up, unguarded and thrilled. No trace of anything but pure joy for his friend. Sweat that explodes? That's incredible. That's such a good quirk. You could do so much with that. You could. Midoriya. Izuku, the nurse called. That's me. He hopped up, still practically vibrating with secondhand excitement. Wish me luck, Kakin. You don't need luck, Katsuki said, still staring at his own hands. Everybody gets a quirk. It's not luck, it's just biology, my dad said. Inko took her son's hand and led him back through the same door Katsuki had just come bursting out of, and if she felt a small, private twist of unease at those words. Everybody gets a quirk, it's just biology, she did not let it show on her face. Dr. Tsunoda was waiting with the particular gentleness he reserved for this exact appointment. Out of all the appointments he ran in a given week. He'd done this hundreds of times. Most of it was routine. A quirk announced itself in some small physical way by this age, if it hadn't already, and the exam was mostly a formality, a chance to catalog and measure something that had usually already made itself obvious at home in the form of a very surprised parent and a scorch pot holder or a suddenly levitating toy. Hello, Izuku. Climb up on the table 4. Me would you? Hi, Dr. Sonoda. Izuku scrambled up, swinging his legs, entirely unbothered. Did you know Kakin's quirk makes his sweat explode? He's gonna level a whole city block someday, his mom said. Is that so? Dr. Sonoda smiled, checking his ears, his eyes, his reflexes with the small RBB hammer that Izuku always found enormously funny. And what do you think your quirk is going to be? I don't know yet, Izuku said cheerfully. But I hope it's a good one. I want to be a hero. Like All Might. I want to save people and smile the whole time so they're not scared. Something in the doctor's chest gave a small, involuntary ache, the kind that comes from liking a patient rather more than professional distance strictly recommends. That's a fine ambition, he said, and meant it. All right, let's have a look at your feet for me. This was the part of the exam that mattered, in cases where nothing had yet announced itself, and nothing had, with Izuku. No sparks, no strange textures to his skin, no unusual strength when he gripped things. None of the 100 small tells that parents so often reported once you asked the right questions. Dr. Sonoda held Izuku's small foot in his palm, gently manipulated the smallest toe, and felt the familiar geography of it settle under his fingers. And something in his expression, very briefly, before he caught it, went still. 2 joints, not 3. He'd examined that toe 1,000 times. He knew the difference between his own fingers now the way a musician knows an off note before they can even say which one it is. Inko, he said quietly, not looking up yet. Has he ever done anything, even something small, that struck you as unusual? Strength, speed, anything about his body that seemed to not quite match a normal 4-year-old. Inko's hands had gone very still in her lap. No, she said. Nothing. He's just Izuku. Dr. Sonoda set the small foot down gently, straightened, and took off his glasses to clean them on his coat, a habit he fell into whenever he needed a few extra seconds to arrange his words properly. Izuku watched him with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of adult silences. Izuku, he said, crouching now so they were eye level, I want to explain something to you, and I want you to know that whatever I tell you doesn't change one single thing about how wonderful you are. Do you understand? Okay, Izuku said, more solemn now, picking up on the shift in the room the way children always do, half a beat before they understand the reason for it. Most people have 2 joints in their smallest toe, right here. He touched his own foot through his shoe, demonstrating. It's a very old evolutionary marker. From a long time ago, before anyone in the world had a quirk at all. But most people born after quirks appeared have 3 joints instead of 2, because their bodies developed the extra flexibility a quirk needs in order to work properly. It's one of the very first signs we look for. Izuku looked down at his own small foot, wiggling his toes experimentally, not yet understanding but sensing, with the animal instinct of small children, that something important and unwelcome was coming. You have 2 joints, Izuku, Dr. Sonoda said, as gently as 4 words could possibly be arranged. That means you don't have a quirk. It means you're quirkless. The word sat in the room like something dropped from a height. I don't got one? Izuku's voice had gone very small. Not even a little one? Like maybe it's just late. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. And Dr. Sonoda, who had delivered this particular piece of news perhaps 30 times in his career, found himself having to look away for a moment, because something about this specific child, the earnestness of him, the sheer undiluted hope that had been sitting in that small face not 90 seconds earlier, made this one land harder than most. Inko made a sound she hadn't meant to make, something between a gasp and a sob, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. But she managed, but he's so, Doctor, he's the smartest little boy. He reads everything. He remembers everything. Surely that counts for... It absolutely does count for something, Dr. Sonoda said, and this time there was real conviction in it, enough that both Midoriyas looked up at him. In fact, Inko, I ran the standard developmental screening on him while I had him on the table, mostly out of routine. His scores are extraordinary. I don't say that lightly. Whatever else today has taken from him, it hasn't touched his mind, and his mind, from what I can measure, is remarkable. I'd estimate he's operating well above 200 on a standard intelligence scale, possibly higher. That's not something I say about one child in 1,000. It was, in its own quiet, clinical way, the truth, and it was meant as comfort, but Izuku, small for years old, sitting on an exam table with his hope draining visibly out through the soles of his sneakers, did not hear 200 and feel comforted. He heard only the first part. He heard quirkless, and the word sat inside his small chest like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples out toward every future he'd imagined for himself. "But I want to be a hero," he whispered, and his eyes were filling now, that terrible clear brimming of a child trying very hard not to cry and losing. "I want to save people, like All Might. Can I still be a hero if I don't got a quirk?" Neither adult in the room answered him right away, and that silence, more than anything either of them could have said, was the first true heartbreak of Izuku Midoriya's life. Mitsuki and Katsuki were waiting in the small parking lot out front when they emerged, Katsuki still setting off tiny celebratory sparks between his palms every few seconds like he couldn't quite believe his own good fortune. "Took you guys forever," Katsuki said. "What did you get? Betcha it's not as good as mine." Izuku didn't answer. He was staring very hard at a crack in the pavement, his hand gripped tight in his mother's, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen in a way that made Mitsuki's easy grin falter. "Izuku." Katsuki tried again, some genuine confusion creeping into his 4-year-old bravado. "What did you get? Come on, tell me." "He's quirkless, sweetheart," Inko said quietly, because someone had to say it, and she couldn't stand the idea of Izuku having to be the one. Not today, not on top of everything else. "He doesn't have a quirk." Katsuki's face did something complicated. There was a flicker of something almost like sympathy in it. Gone almost as fast as it appeared, chased off by the sheer novelty of the concept, for years old, and encountering for the first time the idea that the world's rules might not apply evenly to everyone he knew. "Quirkless," he repeated, like the word tasted strange in his mouth. "That's not. Everybody's got a quirk," my dad said. "Everybody." "I guess I don't," Izuku said, so quietly it was barely audible. "Huh." Katsuki looked at him for a long moment, small fists still faintly smoking, some new and unfamiliar arithmetic visibly turning over behind his eyes. An arithmetic that had, until 9 minutes ago, always placed the two of them on roughly equal footing, running the same races, climbing the same trees, playing hero and villain as interchangeable roles either of them might someday actually grow into. "Well," he said it slowly, testing the shape of the thought as he spoke it. "Guess that means I'm going to be the hero for real, then. Since you can't." It wasn't cruelty, not yet, not the deliberate, honed cruelty that would come later. It was only a 4-year-old rearranging his understanding of the world according to brand new information, the way children do, blunt and thoughtless rather than malicious. But Izuku heard it the way a much older person might have heard something far crueler, because it was the very first time anyone had ever told him, out loud, that his dream now belonged to someone else by default. He didn't argue. He didn't cry, not right there in the parking lot in front of Kakin. He just nodded, small and quiet, and let his mother lead him to the car, and it was only once the door was shut, and the engine was running, and Mizutofu was sliding by gray and rain-damp outside the window that he finally let the tears come, silent and steady, staring straight ahead. That night, after a dinner neither of them managed to eat much of, Izuku asked, in a very small voice, if they could watch the All Might video again. Inko's first instinct was to say no, some protective maternal reflex that flinched away from the idea of pouring salt directly into a wound less than 12 hours old, but something in his face stopped her. He wasn't asking to torture himself. He was asking the way a person reaches for a familiar object in the dark, something solid to hold on to. So they sat together on the couch, the same worn cushions, the same grainy footage looping on the little television. The collapsed building, the 100 rescued citizens, the enormous golden man raising his fist to a smiling sky. And partway through the second loop, Izuku spoke, so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of the television. Mama, can I still be a hero like him? Even though I don't got a quirk? And Izuku Midoriya, who had spent her entire PRG and NCY promising a version of herself that whatever happened, she would always know exactly the right thing to say to her son, found that she had absolutely nothing. No answer that wasn't a lie. No comfort that didn't feel, in that moment, like a betrayal of the honesty she owed him. "I'm so sorry, Izuku," she whispered instead, and the tears came before she could stop them, hot and immediate, and she pulled him in her lap the way she had the very first day she carried him home from the hospital, wrapped in a yellow blanket she'd knitted herself. "I'm so sorry, baby. I don't know. I wish I could tell you yes. I wish I could tell you it doesn't matter, but I don't want to lie to you, and I don't know, and I'm so sorry." Izuku didn't say anything for a long moment. On the screen, All Might smiled through the wreckage, over and over, endlessly, obliviously cheerful. "It's okay, Mama," he said finally, and it was the first time in his short life he'd said something that wasn't quite true in order to make someone else feel better. A small, unconscious rehearsal, though neither of them could have known it then, for a kindness that would one day become the very core of who he was. "Don't cry. I'll figure something out. I'm real smart, right? Dr. Tsunoda said so. So I'll figure it out." He fell asleep against her shoulder before the video finished its third loop, damp lashes still stuck together. One small fist curled loosely against her collarbone the exact same way it had curled around her finger on the night he was born. Inko sat very still so as not to wake him, and watched the golden man's grainy, endlessly repeating smile, and made herself a second promise to go along with the first one. Whatever it takes, she thought. Whatever this world decides to throw at him. I will never, ever stop believing in you, Izuku. Not for one single day. The years that followed did not go easy on that promise, though they never quite managed to break it either. At 5, on his first day of primary school, a boy named Katsuo Fujimoto asked the whole classroom, with the particular gleeful cruelty that 7-year-olds reserve for anyone different, whether it was true that the Midoriya kid didn't have a quirk at all. And when Izuku, red-faced but resolute, confirmed it, the laughter that went around the room was the kind that leaves a mark long after the sound fades. He'd gone home that day and told his mother, with wobbling determination, that it was fine, that he didn't need everyone to like him, only that someday he'd prove them wrong. And Inko had hugged him and said nothing about how her heart had cracked a little further at the sheer effort it took a 5-year-old to sound brave. At 8, his teacher, a tired, unkind man named Mr. Kaneshiro who had clearly stopped enjoying his job sometime around the Heisei era, handed back an essay Izuku had written about wanting to attend UA High School one day, and read aloud in front of the entire class. "Some dreams simply aren't realistic for everyone, Midoriya. I'd encourage you to consider a career path better suited to your circumstances." And the class had laughed, and Izuku had sat very still with his ears burning, and gone home to fill an entire fresh notebook with hero analysis that night instead of crying about it, because by then he had already discovered that the only thing worse than being laughed at was letting anyone see that it worked. At 11, in a school hallway that smelled permanently of old paper and floor wax, Katsuki Bakugo, no longer the small boy who'd said guess that means I'm going to be the hero with something like reluctant sympathy, but someone harder now, sharpened by 6 years of being told by every adult in his life that he was destined for greatness, had shoved Izuku against a bank of lockers hard enough to rattle them, surrounded by a knot of boys who found this endlessly entertaining, and said loud, enough for the whole hall to hear, "You're worthless, Deku. You know that, right? You've got nothing. No quirk, no chance, nothing. Quit acting like you're going to be anything. You're worthless." It was the first time anyone had used that particular word on him, and it was the first time, though far from the last, that it came from the mouth of the boy who used to let him lean against his shoulder under the elephant slide and cheer for his explosions like they were the greatest thing in the world. Izuku had picked himself up off the lockers, said nothing, and walked the rest of the way to class with his chin up and his eyes stinging, and that evening he'd written in his newest notebook, in handwriting gone slightly unsteady, "Not worthless. Just not finished yet." He never showed that page to anyone. He kept the notebook anyway. By 13, going on 14, there were over 60 of those notebooks stacked in his bedroom closet, Analyses of every hero he could find, footage of their quirks, their combat styles, their weaknesses, their strengths, pages and pages of a boy's entire heart poured into the study of a profession every single authority figure in his life had told him, in one way or another, that he could never actually join. His IQ, tested formally once more at 11 out of pure bureaucratic requirement, had come back even higher than Dr. Tsunoda's early estimate. Comfortably past 200, high enough that the school counselor had made vague, uncomfortable noises about specialized programs that never actually materialized into anything, because no specialized program in Japan existed for a quirkless genius who only wanted to save people. He was bullied, consistently, casually by classmates who'd long since stopped needing a reason, and by at least 2 teachers who found it easier to let it happen than to intervene. He ate lunch alone more often than not. He came home some days with grass stains on his knees from being knocked down and said nothing about it, because he'd learned by 9 or 10 that telling his mother only made her cry, and he had promised himself, quietly, privately, the same year he'd promised her he'd figure it out, that he would rather carry every bit of this alone than watch her carry it too. But none of it broke him. That was the part that would have confused Mr. Kaneshiro and Katsuki Bakugo and every other person who'd ever looked at Izuku Midoriya and seen only a target, if any of them had bothered to look closely enough to notice it. The boy still smiled. Not the brittle, performative smile of someone pretending everything was fine, but something quieter and more stubborn than that. The same smile, in miniature, that a golden-haired hero once wore standing on a collapsed building with 100 people cheering below him. He still stopped to help kids smaller than him who dropped their books in the hall. He still gave half his lunch away without being asked, on the rare occasion someone forgot theirs. He still filled notebook after notebook with the belief, however unreasonable, however unsupported by 2 joints instead of 3, that heroism was a thing you could earn through effort and heart even when the world had already decided you weren't allowed to try. The evening before his 14th birthday, Inko found him sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor surrounded by notebooks, the window cracked open to let in the cool spring air, writing by the light of a small desk lamp long after he should have been asleep. "You should be resting," she said gently, leaning in the doorway. "Big day tomorrow." 14. "Just finishing this page." He didn't look up, pen moving in quick, precise strokes. "I found some new footage of Kamui Woods today. His branch restraint technique has this half-second delay right after activation. I think it's because of how the wood has to actually grow rather than just extend, so there's this little window where," he caught himself, laughed a little sheepish. "Sorry, you don't need the whole lecture." "I don't mind the lecture," Inko said, and meant it, crossing the room to sit beside him on the floor the way she had 100 times before. "You still love this. After everything, I still love this." He set the pen down and looked at her, and there was something in his face at 14, nearly 14, that had not been there at 4, something forged rather than simply grown, a kind of quiet, unshakable resolve that no locker slam or teacher sneer had managed to dislodge in a full decade of trying. "I know what everybody says, Mom. I know what I am, on paper, but I still believe there's a way. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I'm not going to stop looking for it." Inko reached over and smoothed his messy hair back from his forehead, the same gesture she'd used the night he was born, the night he'd first watched All Might smile through the wreckage, the night she'd made him a promise she'd somehow, against every reasonable expectation, managed to keep for 10 straight years. "Then I'll keep believing it with you," she said, "for as long as it takes." Outside his window, Mizudafa settled into its familiar nighttime hum. Trains running somewhere in the distance, the distant thrum of the city that never quite went fully quiet. Utterly unaware that in less than 24 hours, on an ordinary walk to school on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the 14-year-old boy currently falling asleep over his 63rd notebook was about to have the single strangest, most world-altering week of his entire life begin with the sight of a giant woman defeating a villain in a single kick. He had no way of knowing it yet. He only knew, as his eyes finally slipped shut, notebook still open on his chest, that tomorrow he'd get to see real heroes in action again, and that was more than enough to smile about. Some mornings have the decency to warn you before they turn into the worst day of your life. This one didn't bother. It came dressed as an entirely ordinary Tuesday, Gray sky threatening rain that never quite arrived. The smell of miso drifting up the stairwell. A fresh notebook waiting on the kitchen table with its spine not yet cracked. And gave absolutely no indication that by nightfall, Izuku Midoriya's entire world would have come apart and been stitched back together into something no one, least of all him, would recognize. Notebook number 70, Inko said, sliding it across the table along with a plate of rice and grilled fish. That's a lot of notebooks, Izuku. 71, actually. I filled the last one over the weekend. He said it with the particular pride of someone reporting a personal best, dropping into his chair and immediately flipping the fresh cover open to write the date on the first page in his small, precise handwriting. There was a new clip going around of Death Arms taking down a group of armed robbers single-handed. I had to break down his grip strength across 4 separate frames before I could even start on the tactical stuff. Of course you did. Inko smiled into her tea, the fond, slightly exasperated smile of a woman who had long since stopped trying to talk her son out of his hobby and started simply admiring how thoroughly he committed to it. Eat your breakfast before it gets cold. You got a test today, don't you? Math. It's fine, he caught himself mid-sentence, chewing then swallowed. I already worked through the practice set twice. I'll be okay. I know you will. She reached over and smoothed a stray cowlick that never, ever stayed down no matter how many times she flattened it. You always are. He left the apartment 11 minutes later with his bag over one shoulder and the new notebook already half covered in a fine spray of green ink. Walking his usual route past the shuttered flower shop and the vending machines that hummed at the corner of Sakura Lane. And it was there, 3 blocks from school, that the ordinary Tuesday quietly stopped being ordinary at all. He heard it before he saw it. A sound like a dump truck being dropped from a height, followed by the particular high, panic pitch of a crowd that has decided, collectively and instantly, to become an audience instead of a group of pedestrians. Izuku broke into a jog without quite deciding to, notebook already coming out of his bag by pure reflex, and rounded the corner onto Sakura Lane's little shopping stretch, just in time to see a folding table full of discount umbrellas get flattened under something the approximate size and shape of a DLVRY van, except the DLVRY van had arms, and was screaming obscenities at a hero made of wood. Hold still. Kamui Woods' voice was calm, even as it carried the composed baritone of a man who had clearly delivered this exact line to this exact category of villain more times than he could count. Both his forearms had already split open along seams that weren't seams at all, lacquered brown branches whipping out and braiding themselves around the villain's tree trunk legs faster than the eye could track. Lacquered chain prison. You're not getting any farther than this, and you're certainly not walking away from robbing that liquor store 2 blocks back. The villain, a lumbering, top-heavy man, whose quirk seemed to have converted a fairly ordinary physique into something closer to a small oil tanker with legs, bellowed and strained against the restraint, sending a spiderweb of cracks through the pavement beneath his planted feet. Get this off me, you overgrown houseplant. There's a meaningful difference, Kamui Woods continued, unbothered, tightening the wooden coils with a small twist of his wrist, between having power and having the right to use it however you please. Judging by the 6 bottles of shochu currently in your jacket, that's a lesson you never learned. A safe distance back, a broad-shouldered hero with a hose coiled around one forearm. Izuku's notebook already had 3 pages on him. Backdraft, water-based quirk, excellent crowd control instincts. Kept both arms spread wide, sweeping bystanders back with the particular patient firmness of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Everybody stay behind the line, please. Nothing to see that requires you getting any closer. Thank you. Which was, of course, the exact moment the pavement 40 feet up split open like a peach. Izuku's head snapped up along with 300 other heads on the block. What emerged from the crack wasn't a villain at all. It was a woman, easily 60 feet tall now and rising, her business casual blazer somehow scaling perfectly with the rest of her, one enormous stiletto heel already cocked back like the world's most dangerous ballet pose. Sorry, tree boy, she bellowed, and even at that volume there was something unmistakably delighted in it. The particular joy of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in a mirror at least 40 times. But I believe this one's mine. Wait, Kamui Wood started. But wait was not a word that factored into whatever plan the giantess had made for herself, and her heel came down with the force of a dropped meteor directly onto the villain's skull. Crump! The pavement didn't just crack this time. It folded, an entire section of Sakura Lane's little shopping street buckling downward like a dropped tarp, dust and pulverized concrete billowing outward in a gray wave that sent half the crowd stumbling backward with their arms thrown up over their faces. When it cleared, the villain lay flattened and unconscious in a shallow crater, and the giantess had already begun, with visible relish, to shrink back down to a far more photogenic 5'9", straightening her blazer as 3 separate phones came up around her in the same half-second. In that, she announced to no one and everyone, striking a hand-on-hip pose that had clearly also been rehearsed, is a debut you're not going to forget anytime soon. Mount Lady, everybody, remember the name because you're going to be seeing a lot more of it. The crowd, God help them, cheered. Kamui Woods stood exactly where he had been standing, both forearms still extended. Wooden coils now wrapped around a piece of pavement that used to have a villain attached to it, wearing the specific expression of a man doing extremely difficult arithmetic on how much of his own morning had just been stolen by someone else's heel. I had him fully restrained, he said, to absolutely no one who was listening. You should thank me, Mount Lady called back over her shoulder, already turning to give a second, better angle to the assembled phones. I saved you the paperwork. Izuku, notebook already 3/4 filled with rapid, slanting handwriting, hadn't looked up from the page since the crater formed. If gigantification scales her mass along with her height, he was scribbling, pen moving almost independently of conscious thought, then either her density has to drop dramatically to avoid literally sinking through the pavement under her own weight at full size, or she's somehow generating the extra mass from somewhere, which raises about 6 new questions about where that mass goes when she shrinks back down, and whether there's a caloric cost to. You're taking that awfully seriously for a kid on his way to school. Izuku startled, nearly dropping the pen. A middle-aged man in a DLVRY uniform stood a few feet away, one eyebrow raised, clearly amused by the sight of a young teenager filling an entire notebook page while an actual disaster site smoked gently behind him. Sorry, I like to understand how quirks actually work, not just what they look like from the outside. Izuku flushed, tucking the notebook half behind his back on reflex, an old habit from years of being laughed at for exactly this. It's a hobby. Ah, you thinking about being a hero yourself, then? There it was, the question that always arrived eventually, the one Izuku had learned to brace for the way you brace for a step you know is uneven. He could have deflected. He'd gotten very good, over the years, at deflecting. He didn't, this time. Something about the wreckage and the cheering crowd and the bright, ordinary morning made him say it plainly instead. Yeah, I am. He met the man's eyes. I'm going to do my best. The man blinked, clearly having expected a mumbled non-answer, and then, surprisingly, genuinely smiled. Good for you, kid. Good luck. He hitched his DLVRY bag higher on his shoulder and moved on into the thinning crowd, and Izuku stood there for one more moment, notebook clutched to his chest, watching Mount Lady pose for one final photo before he remembered, with a small jolt, that he had a math test in 11 minutes and an entire city block still to cross. He ran the rest of the way to Aldera Junior High, and he was smiling the whole time. The smile lasted exactly until 3rd PRD. All right, settle down, settle down. Their homeroom teacher, a perpetually tired man named Mr. Sakurai, who had clearly given this same lecture to this same grade level for more consecutive years than he cared to think about, dropped a thick stack of printouts onto his desk with the enthusiasm of a man handling wet laundry. I know, it's that time of year again. Career aptitude forms. I'm required to hand these out, you're required to fill them in, and every single one of you is going to write the exact same thing regardless of what I say next, so let's just get it over with. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Sakurai began working down the rows, dropping a form on each desk without much ceremony. For the 6 of you who are somehow still deciding whether or not you want to be heroes. More laughter because there were, of course, no such 6 students in the room. I'll remind you that UA High School's entrance exam is notoriously difficult, that fewer than 1 in 400 applicants pass it most years, and that a strong academic record will not save you if you can't back it up in the practical. You don't need to explain the exam to me. Katsuki Bakugo didn't so much interrupt as simply overrule. kicking his feet up onto the empty desk in front of him, both palms already crackling faintly with the small orange sparks that had become as much a part of his daily presence as his own name. And don't put my name in the same sentence as the rest of these extras. I'm not applying with a 50% shot like everybody else in this room. I'm getting the highest entrance score UA's seen in a decade. Wow. Thanks for the vote of confidence, but Kago, muttered a boy 2 rows back, not quite quietly enough. Shut up. It's not an insult, it's math. But Kago didn't even bother turning around. I aced the mock exam, full marks on the written, and my quirk assessment scored higher than anybody in this district's seen since they started keeping records. I'm not just getting into UA. I'm going to blow past every hero currently working, and in a few years I'm going to be standing where All Might stands. Number 1. You can quote me on that. There was a beat of silence that was almost respectful, because even the students who found Bakugo insufferable, which was most of them, couldn't entirely dismiss a boast when the numbers behind it were, infuriatingly, real. Ambitious, Sakurai said dryly, continuing down the row with the forms. Well, since we're on the subject, he glanced at his roster, more out of habit than necessity, because he already knew exactly whose name was coming up. Midoriya's application to UA is also on file with the guidance office for the record. The classroom turned as one body, a full physical rotation of 30-some heads, toward the desk near the window where Izuku sat with his pencil frozen halfway through writing his own name at the top of the form. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. Not at first. It was the easy, thoughtless kind, the kind that comes from a joke everyone already agrees on before it's even finished being told. Midoriya? UA. A girl in the front row actually had to wipe her eyes. Oh my god, are you serious? What's he gonna do? Write them a really detailed essay about it. He can't even get through gym class without tripping over his own feet, someone else added. There's no way he passes a hero course entrance exam. All he does is take notes on other people being heroes. Maybe that's the plan, the first boy from earlier called out. Study hard enough, and you don't need a quirk at all, right, Midoriya? More laughter, bigger this time, rolling across the room in a wave. Izuku kept his eyes on his desk, ears burning, pencil gripped a little too tightly in his hand. And it was into that noise, with the easy cruelty of someone who'd been waiting for an opening, that Bakugo spoke. Hey! Just the one word, but it cut through the laughter like a blade, because when Katsuki Bakugo used that particular flat tone, people generally shut up to listen. He'd swiveled fully around in his seat now, red eyes fixed on Izuku with something that had curdled, somewhere over the past 10 years, from childhood exasperation into something considerably colder. You're not seriously trying this again, are you, Deku? I'm not trying anything, Kakin. Izuku made himself look up, made himself keep his voice steady even though his pulse was hammering. I'm not trying to compete with you. I know I'm not on your level. I just want to try. That's all. I won't know if I can do it unless I actually try. You won't know. Bakugo repeated it like the words tasted bad. He snapped his fingers, a small, controlled pop of orange light and a curl of smoke, close enough to Izuku's desk that a few papers fluttered. Half the class flinched. Izuku didn't, mostly because he'd had a decade of practice not flinching. Let me save you the trouble, then, so you actually do know. You're quirkless. You've got nothing. No power, no advantage, nothing that separates you from a normal civilian except a very expensive collection of notebooks. Don't put yourself on the same level as people who actually have something to bring to that exam. It's insulting. I'm not trying to put myself on your level, Izuku said quietly. I never said I was as strong as you, Kakin. I just want the chance to. There is no chance. Bakugo's voice rose, sharp enough now that even Sakurai, halfway through handing out the last of the forms, paused. You understand that, right? That exam isn't a participation trophy. It's impossible for you. Not hard. Not a long shot. Impossible. So do everybody a favor and quit acting like some notebook full of scribbles is going to change what you are. The class had gone from laughing to simply watching now, the specific uncomfortable hush that settles over a room when a joke has curdled into something people don't quite want to be part of, but also don't want to stop. Izuku said nothing else. He'd learned, a long time ago, that there was no version of this argument he could win out loud, that the only answer that had ever actually worked was the quiet, private kind, written down in a notebook nobody else was allowed to read. Sakurai cleared his throat, dropped the last of the forms, and moved the class along to the actual lesson with the practiced haste of a man avoiding a headache he'd already had 400 times before. Izuku bent back over his own form, wrote UA High School. Hero course in the blank at the bottom in handwriting that was very slightly less steady than it had been 10 minutes earlier, and did not look up again for the rest of the PRD. 3 kilometers away, in a part of the city with narrower streets and fewer working streetlights, something without a fixed shape was currently oozing its way out of a convenience store's shattered front window with a cash register clutched against what might generously be called its chest. It didn't have a face, not really, just a suggestion of one, pressed temporarily into the surface of its own churning, viscous body. 2 dark hollows that might have been eyes fixed on the handful of pedestrians who'd frozen mid-stride at the sight of it. It left a trail behind it like an overturned bottle of dark syrup, and it moved with a horrible, boneless fluidity, less like something walking and more like something being poured. That's the 3rd robbery this week, a woman said, pressed against a nearby wall with her hand over her mouth. There's no end to it. No end to any of them. You clean up one villain, and 3 more crawl out of the woodwork. There's an end to them, said a voice from somewhere near the mouth of the alley the creature was oozing toward. Calm, warm, and entirely too confident for the situation, though nobody could quite place where it was coming from. There's always an end to them, eventually. The woman turned, searching the shadows for whoever had spoken. She found nothing but an empty street and the retreating gleam of something wet and slime-slick vanishing around the corner, moving with singular purpose toward the quieter, less populated blocks on the far side of the district. Toward, as it happened, though nobody watching could have possibly known it yet, a particular 14-year-old boy who was, at that very moment, 3 streets over and walking home from school with a scorched notebook and a very bad afternoon still ahead of him. The scorching came first. Izuku had his phone out, thumb scrolling past a breaking local news alert. Slime-type villain eludes police. 3rd incident this week. Citizens advise to avoid alleys near. When the familiar, dreaded scrape of sneakers on the school stairwell behind him told him, before he'd even turned around, exactly whose afternoon was about to collide with his. Still writing in that thing. Bakugo's voice, flanked by the low chuckling of the 2 boys, who trailed him everywhere like a matched set of shadows. Thought maybe after this morning you'd have gotten the hint. I'm just walking home, Kakin. Izuku kept moving, notebook tucked under one arm, phone still in hand, doing his best impression of a boy who hadn't heard anything at all. It had never once worked. It didn't work now either. A hand closed around the strap of his bag and yanked, hard enough to spin him half around, and the notebook, 71, brand new that very morning, not even a full day old, went skidding across the concrete and out of reach. Hey, you know what your problem is? Bakugo crouched, picked the notebook up by its spine like something faintly distasteful, and flipped it open to a page dense with Izuku's cramped, careful analysis of Mount Lady's debut from that very morning. You think if you just write down enough stuff about real heroes, some of it rubs off on you. Like it's contagious. His palm sparked, close enough to the page that the paper's edge began to curl and blacken. It's not contagious, Deku. You can fill up 1,000 of these things, and you're still going to be exactly what you are. Kakin, don't. The small explosion that followed wasn't large. Bakugo had exquisite control even at 14, precise enough to singe 70 pages to ash without so much as scorching his own palm, but it was more than enough to turn 71's careful months of work into a fluttering handful of blackened confetti, and more than enough, with a following flick of his wrist, to send the smoking remains of the cover sailing out through the stairwell's open window into the courtyard 3 floors below. There. Now you've got some free time. Bakugo dropped the empty air where the notebook used to be and turned to go, his 2 shadows falling in a step behind him, already laughing. He paused at the top of the stairs, though, and looked back, and something in his face, for just a moment, was a mockery so much as something flatter and colder, something that had been building in him for 10 years and had finally found, in this exact moment, its clearest possible expression. Do yourself a favor, Deku, he said. Give up on UA. Better yet, why don't you take a swan dive off this roof and save us both the trouble of watching you try and fail for the next 4 years? He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He was gone down the stairwell before the words had even finished settling, laughter trailing behind him and his friends, and Izuku was left alone on the landing with nothing but the smell of smoke and the sight of his own notebook's charred pages drifting down into the empty courtyard like gray snow. He didn't say anything back. He never did. Arguing had never once worked, not in 10 years of trying every version of it he could think of. And so he'd learned, the way you learn to stop touching a stove, to simply let the words land and keep walking. He went down to the courtyard instead and knelt to gather what was left. Most of it was ash. A few pages had survived at the edges, curled and browned, but legible, and he collected those with the same careful reverence he'd have given something far less replaceable, because in a way, to him, it was. And crouched there, ash on his fingers, something old and familiar rose up behind his eyes the way it always did on days like this one. Not a memory so much as a wound with a very specific shape, one he'd carried since he was 4 years old in a cramped exam room with 2 joints where there should have been 3. He could still feel it, even now, 10 years later, his mother's hand tightening in his. The word quirkless landing in the room like something dropped from a height. A television screen looping the same grainy footage of a golden-haired man smiling through wreckage, over and over, while his mother cried and said, "I'm so sorry, baby, I don't know," into his hair. "I'll figure it out," he'd told her, at 4 years old, and he'd meant it with his whole small chest, and 10 years and 71 notebooks later, kneeling in a courtyard full of his own ashes, he still meant it. Even if some days, this one included, it was getting harder to remember exactly why. He gathered what pages he could, tucked them into his bag, and kept walking home. The alley he cut through to shave 5 minutes off his walk was quiet in the particular way empty alleys are quiet right before they aren't, the kind of silence that has a hell breath in it. He didn't notice the manhole cover until it wasn't a manhole cover anymore, until it had become a ragged hole with something dark and wet and enormous surging up out of it directly into his path. He had exactly 1/2 second to register the shape of it. The same slime-bodied villain from the news alert on his phone, up close now and considerably more horrifying than a headline had managed to convey, before it lunged, and then there was no more time to register anything at all, because it had wrapped itself around him like a fist closing, and the world went dark and wet and airless all at once. "Need a body," something that wasn't quite a voice said inside the churning mass, thick and gurgling, pressed so close to his own skull it felt like the thought was happening inside his own head. "Need to hide. They're close. Just need to borrow this one for a minute. Kid, hold still." Izuku couldn't scream. He couldn't breathe. His hands clawed uselessly at a surface that had no purchase to give, his lungs already screaming their first warning, his vision beginning to swim gold. And black at the edges, and through the muffling, suffocating dark he thought, with the strange clarity that sometimes visits people in the worst possible moments, "This is it. This is really it. I'm going to die in an alley 3 blocks from my apartment, and nobody will even know where to look." And then the sky exploded. There was no other way to describe the sound that arrived a 1/2 second later. A concussive crack of displaced air, like a localized clap of thunder with a fist behind it. And the slime around Izuku's body didn't so much release him as get physically ripped away from him by something that had touched only the villain and never so much as grazed the boy trapped inside it. He hit the pavement hard, choking, drenched from head to foot in cooling, foul-smelling residue, dragging in one enormous whooping breath after another, while somewhere above him a voice like a foghorn made of pure, unshakable confidence rolled down the alley walls. "Have no fear, young man, for today, once again, I have arrived in time." Izuku looked up, vision still swimming, coughing slime out of his throat, and found himself staring directly into the shins of the single most famous human being in the entire country. All Might, golden hair catching the gray afternoon light like it had its own private sun, muscles straining the seams of a costume that seemed personally offended by the idea of fabric, had one boot planted firmly on what remained of the slime villain, which had gone from a menacing, boneless mass to a stunned, twitching puddle in the wake of whatever had just hit it. The symbol of peace crouched down, scooped up 2 empty 2-liter bottles that had apparently been tucked into his belt this entire time. One already half full of leftover sports drink, both now hastily emptied onto the pavement. and with the brisk efficiency of a man who had clearly done this exact maneuver before, began scooping the dazed, protesting villain directly into them, screwing the caps down tight over its muffled complaints. "There we are. That ought to hold you until the police arrive." He set both bottles down with a satisfied nod, wiped his hands on his thighs, and only then turned his full attention to the drenched, coughing teenager sprawled against the alley wall. "And you, young man, are you hurt?" Izuku's mouth opened and closed several times without producing anything useful. This close, All Might was somehow both exactly and nothing like the grainy footage Izuku had watched 1,000 times over 10 years. The same impossible grin, the same overwhelming, room-filling presence. But real now, closer than he'd ever imagined getting, closer than he'd let himself dream about since he was 4 years old, crying in front of a television screen. His hand moved before his brain caught up with it, diving into his bag for a pen and the surviving, scorched fragments of Notebook 71, some instinct 10 years deep insisting that this was a moment that required an autograph, right now, before it slipped away like every other impossible thing in his life always did. Would you? If it's not too much trouble, could I get your—" He flipped frantically through the singed pages, hunting for a blank corner, and stopped dead when he found one that very clearly already wasn't blank. A looping, familiar signature, dated 8 months earlier, from a charity meet and greet at the Musudafu Community Center. He'd stood in line for 4 hours to attend and had apparently, in the fog of the last 90 seconds, completely forgotten he already had. "You already have one," All Might observed, peering over with obvious amusement. "Charity event, if I'm remembering the venue correctly. You waited a very long time in that line, as I recall. I believe I told you your enthusiasm was, and I quote myself here, the kind that builds heroes. You remember that?" Izuku's voice cracked embarrassingly. "I remember every young person who waits 4 hours in the rain for 30 seconds with an old man in tights." All Might's grin softened, just slightly, into something more private. It tends to stick with a person for one shining, suspended moment. Kneeling in a slime-soaked alley with a charred notebook in his lap, Izuku Midoriya felt something close to pure, unfiltered joy. And it was in the middle of that feeling, buoyed by it, that the question he'd carried for 10 years finally worked its way loose before he could stop it. "All Might, sir, can I ask you something? Something real, not fan stuff." "Of course. Could somebody without a quirk ever actually be a hero? Like you? I don't mean, filing paperwork or doing support work behind the scenes. I mean actually out there, actually saving people the way you do." He was talking too fast now, the way he always did when the thing he was saying mattered more than he could stand to admit out loud. "Because I've been quirkless my whole life, and everybody's always told me it's impossible, and I've never once believed them. Not really, not all the way, but I've also never had anybody who actually knows tell me one way or the other, and I need to know. Please. Is it possible?" The alley went very quiet. All Might's grin, for the first time since he'd landed, didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, some calculation Izuku couldn't quite read, and when he finally crouched down properly to bring himself closer to eye level, his voice had lost its booming public register entirely, gone low and careful, and, for the first time, tired in a way Izuku hadn't expected. "Being a hero," he said slowly, "means being willing, every single day, to put your body between danger and the people who can't protect themselves. It means walking toward exactly the thing every instinct in you is screaming to run from. Heroes get hurt, son. Heroes get hurt badly, and often, and sometimes they don't walk away from it at all. And the only thing standing between a hero and that outcome, most days, is the raw physical power to survive what the job demands of them." He paused. A quirk isn't just a nice thing to have in this line of work. It's very often the only thing keeping a hero alive long enough to save anyone at all. "But I'm smart," Izuku said, and hated how small his voice had gone. "I've studied every hero I could find footage of for 10 years. I know quirk theory better than most licensed heroes I've read about. I don't doubt any of that for a second." All Might's hand came to rest on his shoulder, heavy and warm even through the slime-soaked fabric of his uniform. "But intelligence doesn't stop a falling building, son. It doesn't stop a villain's fist, or a collapsing structure, or fire. or any of the 1,000 ordinary disasters a hero walks into on any given Tuesday. I would be doing you a terrible disservice. I would be lying to you in the worst possible way about the worst possible thing if I told you that wanting this badly enough was going to be sufficient to keep you alive out there. He held Izuku's gaze, and there was real, unmistakable regret in it, the reluctance of a man saying something he wished with his whole chest that he didn't have to say. I can't tell you that you can do this. I wish I could. I really do. But I won't lie to a boy who just asked me the most honest question anyone's asked me all year. He patted Izuku's shoulder once, gently, and straightened back to his full towering height. I'm sorry, he said, but it's the truth. Izuku said nothing. There was nothing really to say, no argument that would work on this, the same way no argument had ever worked on Bakugo, except this time it wasn't cruelty behind the words. It was something worse, in a way. It was kindness and honesty, and the simple, immovable fact of it landing exactly where Bakugo's had landed 3 hours earlier, in the same tender, well-worn place. All Might crouched to collect his 2 bottles of squirming, muffled villain, glanced down at his own belt pouches. Narrow, meant for smaller things, not built to secure 2 liters of struggling captured slime for a rooftop speed getaway, and clicked his tongue in mild irritation. Ah, blast. These pockets were never built for cargo duty. He produced a roll of heavy tape from somewhere in his costume with the ease of a man well-practiced in improvisation, wound several loops around each bottle, and strapped them firmly to the outside of his thigh, testing the hold with one experimental bounce on the ball of his feet. There. That'll do until the station. He looked back once more at the boy still sitting in the wreckage of the alley, drenched, ash-stained, notebook clutched to his chest, and something almost like an apology flickered across his face one final time. Take care of yourself, young man. The world needs people who care as much as you clearly do, even if it doesn't always need them standing on the front line. And then, with a bend of his knees and a burst of displaced air that sent loose trash spinning in a small cyclone down the alley, he was gone, bounding rooftop to rooftop toward the nearest police station with 2 bottles of muffled villain taped to his leg, leaving Izuku alone in the settling quiet with nothing but the smell of slime and the fading echo of "I'm sorry, but it's the truth" ringing in his ears. He sat there for a long time after the sound of All Might's leaps had faded into the general hum of the city. Long enough that the gray afternoon lights started sliding, without much fanfare, into evening. Long enough that his uniform had gone from soaked to merely damp, and the last of the adrenaline had drained out of his legs and left them shaking in its wake. Eventually he stood, because there was nothing else productive to do with sitting in an alley, and started the walk home. He didn't cry, which surprised him a little. He'd expected to. Instead, there was just a low, steady ache behind his ribs, and underneath it, stubborn as ever, the same small ember that had survived 10 years of doctors and bullies and now, apparently, the single most respected hero in Japan telling him no to his face. Okay, he thought, wiping slime-damp hands on his equally slime-damp trousers. Okay, so that's a no from him too. That's fine. I'll figure something else out. I always do. He turned down a quieter side street to cut the last stretch of his walk shorter, the streetlights flickering on one by one overhead in the gathering dark, and it was somewhere around the 3rd empty block. No shops here, just shuttered garage doors and one dead street lamp casting an unlit gap across the pavement, that the hair on the back of his neck stood up all at once, for no reason he could immediately name. He kept walking, told himself it was nothing. The city was always full of small sounds at dusk. A stray cat, a loose shutter, nothing at all. Then he heard it clearly, a footstep, deliberately soft, falling out of rhythm with his own about 15 feet behind him. Then a second set, matching pace from the opposite side of the street. Izuku's genius mind, the same one that had spent 10 years dissecting hero footage frame by frame, went very cold and very fast, running through exits and distances and angles before the fear had even fully caught up to the calculation. And when he finally allowed himself to glance back over his shoulder just once, and saw 2 shapes closing the gap between them with the unhurried confidence of people who had done this exact thing many times before, every part of that genius mind arrived at the same single, screaming conclusion at once. Run. He ran. He ran, and for the first several blocks, running was enough. His body knew what to do even when his mind was still catching up. Legs pumping, arms driving, sneakers slapping wet pavement in a rhythm that ate up ground faster than fear alone could have managed. Izuku cut left at the corner of a shuttered bicycle shop, right past a row of vending machines humming uselessly in the dark, and didn't dare look back because looking back cost time, and time was the only thing he had left to spend. "Little rabbit's fast," one of the shapes behind him said, and the voice was wrong in a way that made Izuku's stomach drop even further than it already had. Too calm, too amused, the voice of a man watching a mildly entertaining television program rather than chasing down a 14-year-old boy through the back streets of Mizudafu. "Don't lose him. Boss wants this one delivered whole." Delivered. Not caught. Not stopped. Delivered like a package. Like something already owned. His genius mind, the same mind that had filled 71 notebooks with careful, patient analysis of other people's power, turned that single word over even as his lungs began to burn, and did not like a single conclusion it produced. He forced himself to think instead of just run. Left is a dead-end alley behind the noodle shop. Right loops back toward the main road but adds 400 meters. Straight ahead the block breaks into that maze of loading docks behind the old textile warehouses, and gambled on the warehouses because a maze, even an unfamiliar one, was better odds than a straight line with two grown men closing the gap behind him. It was the wrong gamble. He understood that the instant he took it, the way you understand a mistake exactly 1/2 second too late to undo it. The loading dock maze was narrower than he'd hoped, its corners sharper, its walls slicker with old rain and rust runoff that made his sneakers skid twice, cost him precious footing both times. His lungs had gone from burning to something closer to screaming. Hot ash dragged in and out with every breath. His thighs shaking with the particular deep, bone-level fatigue of a body that has never once been trained for this. He rounded what he was almost certain was his final turn, angling for a gap between two dumpsters that his 200 IQ brain had clocked 3 streets back as a possible narrow escape route for someone his size, and slammed instead into a wall of cold, wet brick. A dead end. The gap he'd remembered belonged to a different alley entirely. His mind, for the first time in 10 years of trusting it without question, had gotten something wrong at exactly the moment it mattered most. "No," he whispered, pressing both palms flat against the brick as if he could will it into a door. "No, no, no." He spun, back to the wall, chest heaving, and watched the two shapes resolve out of the gloom at the alley's mouth. Unhurried now, because they knew, the way he knew, that there was nowhere left for either of them to go. Two men. Ordinary jackets, ordinary faces, nothing about them that marked them as anything other than men you'd pass on a train platform without a second glance, and somehow that was worse than if they'd looked like monsters. His eyes darted, cataloging with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to every hero's fight footage. Loose brick 2 feet up on the left. Could I climb? No, not fast enough. Drain pipe on the right. Rusted through at the base. Wouldn't hold my weight past the first meter. Nothing. There's nothing. And found, for the first time in his life, that his own intelligence had absolutely nothing useful left to offer him. "Easy now," the first man said, holding up both palms in a gesture that might have looked placating on anyone else. "This doesn't have to get difficult, kid. You just relax, and this'll be over before you even..." "Wait." Izuku's voice cracked, and he hated that it cracked, hated that after everything. After Bakugo, after Mr. Kaneshiro, after 10 years of refusing to let his voice shake in front of anyone who wanted to see it, it finally broke now in front of two strangers in an alley. "Please, whatever this is, whatever you think you need me for, I'm nobody, I'm quirkless, there's nothing special about me. Please, just..." "Funny," the second man said, almost gently, closing the last few feet of distance with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this exact thing more times than he cared to count. "That's exactly why you're perfect." The needle found the side of his neck before he even saw the man's hand move. The sting was small, smaller than he'd braced for, almost disappointingly ordinary for something that immediately turned the whole world sideways. And then the cold followed it, a thick, spreading numbness that flooded down through his shoulder and out along his arms like frost creeping across a window pane. His knees buckled. His hand shot out and found only wet brick, nothing to hold, and somewhere very far away he heard his own voice say, "Wait, please," in a slur so thick it barely sounded like language at all. The last thing he saw, before the alley folded itself into a smear of streetlight and shadow and finally into nothing, was his own notebook, the one he'd salvaged from that morning's ashes, the one with 71 written on the spine in his own careful hand, sliding out of his bag and landing face down in a puddle 3 feet away, forgotten, exactly the way he was about to be. He woke to primary colors, and for one disoriented, floating moment, some small childish part of him thought he might be dreaming of a kindergarten classroom. That impression lasted exactly as long as it took his vision to sharpen. The walls were painted a bright, cheerful sky blue on one side and a buttery, sunlit yellow on the other, the kind of colors you'd choose for a nursery, for a room meant to comfort small children, except the air didn't smell like a nursery at all. It smelled like ozone, sharp and electric, undercut by something chemical and faintly rotten that his mind, still swimming through the last of the sedative fog, eventually identified as formaldehyde. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in a flat, clinical white that made the cheerful paint look obscene rather than comforting. And when he tried to move his arms, they wouldn't come. Restraints, high-tensile steel, cold against his wrists, buckled tight across a metal table angled just slightly upright so he could see the room without being able to leave it. Panic arrived a half-second before the rest of his memory did. The alley, the needle, the two men. And he had to fight it back down hard, had to remind himself, with the same DSPLN he'd used for 10 years to keep his voice steady in front of Bakugo, that panic was information his brain couldn't afford to waste right now. Across the room, two figures in white lab coats moved between banks of humming equipment, their backs half-turned, their conversation pitched low and clinical, the tone of two co-workers discussing an unremarkable Tuesday. Experiment 5170 is finally stabilized, the man said, tapping something on a monitor without much interest, the words landing on Izuku's ears like a verdict he didn't yet understand. He was younger than Izuku had expected a mad scientist to look, sharp-featured, his lab coat pressed with an almost fussy precision. About time. He's set to be delivered to the young MSTR within the week. Shigaraki's been demanding his new toy for over a month now, and you know how tedious he gets when he's kept waiting. Shigaraki. The name landed somewhere in Izuku's chest like a dropped stone. Even a boy who spent his life studying heroes rather than villains knew that name. League of Villains, the one the news anchor said in the careful, clipped voice reserved for genuine dread. Finally, the woman sighed, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite boredom and wasn't quite fear, some uneasy middle ground between the two. She was older, her hair pulled back severe and tight, and her eyes kept flicking, almost against her will, toward a heavy door on the far side of the room, a door with a small reinforced window, dark on the other side. That thing in the next room genuinely unsettles me, Suda. It follows every command down to the letter, but when it's dormant, it just stands there, doesn't blink, doesn't shift its weight. Those black eyes and that smile, it gives me actual shivers looking at it. Well, don't start getting sentimental about our containment units now, Amaya, of all the stages to develop a conscience. The man, Suda, apparently, pulled a glowing canister free from a pressurized dock along the wall, the violet liquid inside catching the fluorescent light and throwing small, shifting patterns across the ceiling. He drew a shimmering measure of it into a syringe the length of Izuku's forearm, checking the volume against a readout with the same fussy precision he brought to everything else. Let's get the human infusion underway before the boss starts asking why we're behind schedule again. The super soldier serum needs a living catalyst to stabilize properly, you know this. Izuku's heart, already hammering, found a new and worse gear entirely. A living catalyst. Him. They meant him. He forced his breathing to slow, forced the fog of the sedative back by sheer will, and let his genius mind do the only thing it had ever really been good for. Take the world apart into pieces small enough to solve. Restraints. High-tensile steel, but not new. Scuffed at the buckle edges. The bolt at my left wrist has a faint discoloration, oxidation, probably from repeated exposure to whatever they used to sterilize this table between subjects. Oxidized metal is weaker metal. If I can find the right angle. He kept his face slack, his eyes half closed, playing at unconsciousness a beat longer than his body actually needed to, and watched the two scientists approach through lashes he barely let flutter. He timed his breathing to something slow and even. He waited. Steady, Suda murmured, more to himself than to anyone, syringe angled toward the soft skin of Izuku's inner arm. Won't take but a moment. And then, Izuku moved. He didn't pull against the restraint. Pulling was what they'd expect, what the steel was built to resist head-on. Instead, he twisted, sharp and sudden, torquing his wrist at an angle no comfortable joint should have allowed, driving every ounce of desperate strength he had directly into that one weakened, oxidized bolt. Snap. The sound was small, almost delicate, and it bought him exactly the half-second of stunned hesitation he needed. His freed fist came up and connected with Suda's jaw with every bit of force a frightened, cornered 14-year-old body could generate. Not much by the standards of the heroes he'd studied for a decade, but more than. Enough to send the man staggering backward into a bank of monitors with a strangled grunt of surprise. "Hey, we got an escapee." Amaya's shriek cut through the room a half-second later, one hand already slapping down on a red SWCH mounted beside the door. Izuku didn't wait to see Suda fall the rest of the way. He was already twisting his other wrist free of the loosened buckle, already scrambling off the table on legs that didn't want to hold him yet, already running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate, single-minded calculation his mind had been building since the moment he opened his eyes. Exit signs. I saw exit signs through the door's crack before they closed it. Second corridor on the left. Move, move, move. Klaxons erupted overhead. A high, rhythmic wail that seemed to physically shake the fillings in his teeth. Red emergency lights strobing the corridor beyond the door into a jerking, stuttering nightmare of shadow and glare. He tore through it anyway, sneakers slapping against sterile white tile, the heavy thud of guards' boots already converging from somewhere behind and ahead of him both, his vision beginning to swim at the edges from exertion his body simply hadn't recovered enough to give. He rounded a corner too fast, shoulder clipping the wall hard enough to spin him half around, and slammed his full weight against the first door he found. Heavy, reinforced, unlocked only by luck or oversight, and half fell, half stumbled through it into a darkened, cavernous room beyond, going down hard onto his hands and knees on cold concrete. He looked up, and every single thought in his genius mind simply stopped. It was 18 feet tall. He would think, much later, if there was ever a later left to think in, that this was the single strangest thing about the moment. That his first coherent thought, staring at something that violated every law of biology he understood, was simply a measurement. 18 feet. He'd cataloged Mount Lady's maximum height that very morning at 40 meters, dashed off half a page of speculative math about mass-to-density ratios, and some small, stubborn, still-functioning corner of his brain was doing the same thing now, entirely without his permission, because cataloging was the only language his fear knew how to speak. The creature stood motionless in the center of the vaulted chamber, a spindly, impossible silhouette wrapped in thick, matted, electric blue fur that seemed to drink in the room's dim emergency lighting rather than reflect it. Its arms hung far too long at its sides, ending in oversized yellow mittened hands, and its head, a wide, disproportionate triangle, was fixed in a permanent, unmoving grin, red-lipped and ear-to-ear, stretched across a face with nothing behind it. Its eyes were black. Not dark, black, glossy and depthless, the black of a closet door at 3 a.m, fixed on absolutely nothing at all. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. Or if it did, Izuku couldn't see the rise and fall of it. It simply stood, a statue built by someone who had studied the shape of a smile without ever once understanding what a smile was for. In the far corner of the room, a massive apparatus hummed and thrummed with a low, building energy, banks of coiled copper and blinking readouts feeding into a single central housing shaped, absurdly, almost like a film projector scaled up to the size of a DLVRY truck. A worn brass plate riveted to its base read, in stenciled letters, Soul Infuser, Prototype MK. Izuku's eyes found the schematic glowing on a nearby monitor and read it in the fraction of a second his terror allowed him. The same way he'd have read a hero's quirk breakdown on any ordinary Tuesday. Fuses inorganic matter, with a living soul. Transfers consciousness. Erases the physical shell of the donor upon transfer completion. No, he breathed, the word barely more than air. No, no, no. He was on his feet before he'd finished deciding to be, scrambling for the far door, putting as much of the room's cavernous space between himself and that towering blue thing as he possibly could. And it was in doing exactly that, in choosing that single door across the chamber, that he put his own body directly into the narrow, deadly space between the humming machine and the dormant, unmoving creature it had been built to serve. The primary doors slammed open behind him. There he is, a guard's voice, sharp with adrenaline. Don't let him reach the prototype. Izuku didn't stop running. Another guard, panicked, hand already moved forward on pure reflex rather than aim, screamed the activation word for his quirk into the chaos. Ice shard. A jagged spike of frozen moisture tore through the air. Meant for Izuku. Aimed at Izuku, close enough that he felt the cold of its passage graze his shoulder as it screamed past him entirely, missing him by inches through nothing more than the man's own trembling, terrified hand. It buried itself instead in the soul infuser's cooling unit. The machine's low hum broke instantly into something worse. A groaning, screeching whine that climbed in pitch faster than any of them could react to, banks of copper coils flaring and angry, sickly blue as whatever delicate balance had kept the thing stable came apart all at once. A blinding strobe of cerulean light washed the chamber white. Fring! The bolt that erupted from the infuser's core wasn't a beam so much as a detonation of raw, distorted energy, and it caught Izuku square in the chest before he'd even registered the light had fired, throwing him backward off his feet with a force that should have driven him straight into the far wall. He didn't hit the wall. He hit the creature instead. 18 feet of dormant, waiting flesh, and the impact that should have broken every bone in his body produced no sound of breaking at all. Instead, there came a different sound entirely. A low, tearing, ethereal groan, like fabric ripping somewhere just beneath the register of ordinary hearing, and Izuku's body did not crumple against the blue for so much as it began, all at once, to come apart. It's happening to me, he thought, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, almost gentle, entirely at odds with the white-hot agony blooming outward from every cell in his body at once. Mom, I'm sorry, Mom, I never even got to. He thought of her face on the night she'd told him he could still figure it out. He thought, absurdly, of Bakugo at 4 years old, letting him lean against his shoulder under an elephant slide, cheering for a quirk neither of them yet knew would one day divide them so completely. He thought of a golden man smiling through wreckage, over and over, endlessly, and of the same man crouching in an alley not 4 hours earlier saying, I'm sorry, but it's the truth. And he thought, with the very last full and complete thought Izuku Midoriya would ever have as Izuku Midoriya, I still would have tried. Even knowing this, I still would have tried. And then there was only light. His body glowed white-hot, edges dissolving into a fine golden mist, cells and bone and BLD, and every scrap of a 14-year-old boy's ordinary biology unwinding into something that was no longer matter at all. It didn't crash into the creature's hide. It was drawn into it, pulled through blue fur and thick skin like water finding a drain, every particle of him funneled down into the vast, waiting emptiness that had never once, in all its dormant existence, held anything resembling a soul. The infuser, already screaming past every safety threshold it had, gave one final, catastrophic shriek and detonated. Shrapnel tore outward in every direction. Guards threw themselves flat, arms over their heads, as the only working prototype of its kind blew itself into 100 smoking fragments of copper and steel. Acrid smoke rolled through the chamber in a thick, choking wave, and for several long seconds, nobody, not the guards, not the 2 lab technicians now stumbling into the doorway behind them, not a single living soul in that ruined room, could see anything at all. When the smoke finally began to thin, the lead guard's voice came out barely above a whisper. Experiment 5170. He swallowed. The boy. He's gone. The blue creature jerked. It happened all at once, a single sharp, unnatural spasm that ran the length of its 18-foot frame. Its head snapping to one side at an angle no human neck could survive, then slowly, jerkily correcting itself, like a puppet whose strings had just for the very first time been picked up by unfamiliar hands. The vacant black eyes, empty for the whole of the creature's brief existence, sparked suddenly with something none of the watching guards had ever seen in them before. Something that moved, that focused, that looked back. The toy was no longer dormant. Slowly, with the same jerky, off-balance grace that would come to define every motion it ever made again, the creature rose to its full and terrible height, head nearly scraping the vaulted ceiling. It lifted both massive, yellow-gloved hands in front of its face and simply stared at them, turning them, flexing the fused mittened fingers, an expression of profound, wordless confusion somehow visible even on a face built with only one permanent expression available to it. They're huge, something that was no longer quite Izuku, and not yet quite anything else either, thought in the fractured, half-formed way of a mind waking up in an unfamiliar house. They're wrong. Everything's too big, but I feel like my bones are made of air. Experiment 5170, the lead guard shouted, rifle already leveled, his voice cracking with a fear he wasn't quite fast enough to disguise. Status report. Come here now. The creature went still. It looked down at the small, trembling figures with their small, trembling weapons. 5 men who, until this exact moment, had only ever needed to give this room a single order to see it obeyed instantly, unthinkingly, completely. It did not move toward them. Instead, slowly, deliberately, in a way that had never once in the whole span of its brief mechanical existence been part of its programming, the massive triangular head began, very simply, to shake. No. The word arrived from nowhere and everywhere at once. Not spoken, not even fully understood by the thing thinking it, but absolute all the same. The very first choice a creature built to have none had ever made for itself. The guards froze. This thing had never shown defiance before. It had never questioned a single command in the whole of its manufactured life. And now it stood there in the wreckage of the machine that had built it, head still swaying gently from side to side, refusing, simply, quietly, and for reasons none of them could begin to guess at, to obey. Inside that vast, blue-furred skull, Izuku Midoriya was already gone. The boy who had cooed and laughed in his mother's arms on the night he was born. The boy who had wanted, more than anything else in the world, to smile the way a golden hero smiled through wreckage, so that no one around him would ever have to be afraid. The boy who had filled 71 notebooks with a decade of quiet, unbroken hope, and who had asked, in an alley not 4 hours earlier, whether a person without a quirk could still be a hero. All of it, every scrap of him, had been swept away into a dark and bottomless ocean from which nothing was ever coming back. The trauma of the transfer had scorched the memory banks clean. He didn't know his own name. He didn't know this room, or these small frightened men, or the machines smoking in pieces around him. He knew only 2 things, and he would carry both of them, unexplained and unshakable, for as long as whatever he had become continued to exist. A strange, innate pull toward kindness that had no memory attached to it at all, and the absolute, bone-deep certainty that he was no longer human. The genius-level intellect remained, though, flickering behind those black eyes like a candle lit in a house whose owner had just moved away, giving the creature something none of its makers had ever intended it to have. Sentience, awareness, a mind with nowhere left to call home. And as it looked out at the 5 armed men surrounding it, at the ruined machine, at the smoke still curling toward a ceiling it could nearly touch without trying, the thing that had once been Izuku Midoriya felt, in that first full moment of its new existence, only one thing clearly enough to name: curiosity, and somewhere far beneath even that, so faint it was barely there at all, a single guttering ember in an otherwise empty room, the very last, formless echo of a smile. The lead guard's shout cracked through the drifting smoke like a WHB. 5170. I said stand down. His voice would not have carried half so much weight if it hadn't been backed by 5 red pinpricks blooming across Huggy's broad blue chest a half-second later, rifles rising in a ragged, adrenaline-shaking line behind him. On your knees. Hands behind your head. Do it now, or we open fire. Do you understand me? Wait. One of the other guards, younger, his rifle wavering just slightly out of true, half reach for the lead guard's shoulder. He hasn't done anything. He's just standing there. Maybe if we give him a second to... He just refused a direct order for the first time in his existence. Renta, in case you weren't paying attention. Ito didn't take his eyes off the towering shape in front of him, didn't lower his aim by so much as a degree. That thing isn't just standing there. That thing just told us no. You give an 18-foot Nomu a second to think, and you don't get a second chance to correct the mistake. Huggy tilted his head, first one way and then slowly, deliberately the other, the small red dots on his fur shifting and resettling with emotion. The words meant nothing to him. Not one syllable of them landed as language so much as noise, garbled and formless, the way sound might land on an ear that had never once been taught to listen for meaning in it. But the shape of the noise, the sharp, clipped cadence of it, the way 5 small men had gone rigid and their tiny weapons had all turned to point at exactly the same place on his chest, that some ancient and unlearned part of him understood perfectly well. They're afraid. Something in him registered, without words, without a name to attach the feeling to. And they want me to be afraid too. He didn't want to be afraid. He didn't fully understand yet what wanting anything even meant. Not in any way he could have explained. But the feeling rising in his chest right now was enormous and unfamiliar, and it made every muscle down the length of his impossibly long arms twitch and coil without his permission. The ancient animal circuitry of a fight-or-flight response that had once belonged to a 14-year-old boy, now running wild through a body 18 feet tall and utterly unfamiliar to the mind steering it. He didn't mean to attack anyone. He would never, in the whole of whatever life lay ahead of him, entirely understand that he hadn't meant to. He only knew that the sharp men with the sharp voices needed to stop pointing those small metal things at him, and that his body, this new, strange, too large body, seemed to think the fastest way to make that happen was simply to move. He flailed one long arm outward in what some deeply buried instinct insisted was a gesture of distress, of please, stop, go away. The exact same motion a much smaller, much more fragile boy might once have made to ward off a blow he couldn't otherwise avoid. His new strength turned it into something else entirely. Crack boom. The oversized yellow hand connected with the reinforced concrete wall 6 feet to his left, and to Huggy, the impact felt like nothing at all, like pushing his palm through a sheet of wet paper, barely a texture worth noticing. To the 5 men in front of him, it looked and sounded like a demolition charge had gone off inside the room. The wall didn't crack. It disintegrated, a full section of reinforced concrete blasting outward into a shower of rebar and pulverized dust, tearing a jagged, smoking hole clean through into the corridor beyond. For one full second, nobody in that room moved at all. He's gone, Ro. Ito's voice cracked with something that had gone past professional composure entirely and landed somewhere closer to raw animal panic. Open fire. Huggy didn't wait to hear the rest of the order, and some deep, wordless part of him, the same part that had, moments earlier, chosen to shake its head rather than obey, understood with sudden, total clarity that whatever came after that word was not a thing he wanted to be present for. He turned. He ran. It was in every meaningful sense the very first time this body had ever moved on its own. Every step was an argument between instinct and unfamiliarity. His legs were long, longer than any legs had any business being, and every stride he tried to take overshot where his mind expected his foot to land, sent him lurching a half-beat out of rhythm with himself, arms swinging wide and loose in wild, counterbalancing arcs that had nothing to do with grace and everything to do with a body still discovering, one desperate stride at a time, exactly how much of itself there now was to account for. His feet struck the corridor floor in heavy, uneven thumps that rattled the overhead light fixtures in their casings. And yet, for all the clumsiness of it, for all the jerking, animatronic wrongness that would come to define every motion he ever made, there was speed. Buried underneath the awkwardness, too, a raw and staggering velocity that ate the length of the corridor in a handful of lurching strides. Guards' boots pounded somewhere behind him, shouted orders bouncing unintelligibly off sterile white walls. But the sounds fell further and further back the longer he ran, because whatever had been done to this body, whatever twisted, stolen collection of strength and speed had been poured into it, It had not been built with pursuit in mind. It had been built to outrun anything that tried. He didn't know where he was going. He knew only that away was the only direction that mattered. And his long arms reached out ahead of him at every turn, palms slapping wet concrete and steel door frames, hauling his own momentum around corners with a strange, boneless economy that no human body could have managed, more like watching something swing hand over hand through a jungle canopy than watching something run. Behind him, in the wreckage of the room he'd left, the dying machine had one final thing left to give the world. The soul infuser had never been built merely to move a soul from one shell to another. That had only ever been its most visible function. The crude, brutal application of a technology meant, in its truest and most terrible design, to reach into the very architecture of a mind. Memory, identity, the fragile continuous thread that makes a person the same person from one day to the next. When the ice shard tore through its cooling housing and sent every safeguard in its system howling past its limits, it did not simply explode. It remembered one last time, all at once, everything it had ever been asked to touch, and then it let all of that memory go in a single, violent exhale. A ripple of light bled outward from the wreckage, violet blue and utterly silent, moving with the speed of a thought rather than the speed of any ordinary explosion, folding through walls and steel doors and reinforced concrete as though none of it were any more solid than mist. It swept through the facility's every corridor, every locked door, every darkened server room, touching everything and everyone connected, however distantly, to the thing that had, until this exact moment, been called Project HW 1928. 3 kilometers away, in a private laboratory lit by the cold blue glow of a dozen monitors, Dr. Huggy Wuggy was in the middle of adjusting a nutrient drip when the tablet in his other hand simply slid from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His eyes went distant. His pupils, ordinarily wide and heavy-lidded with the particular fatigue of a man who had lived through more decades than his body had any right to hold together, shrank to 2 flat pinpricks, as though something behind them had briefly, violently gone out. He stood there for perhaps 4 full seconds, swaying very slightly, and then blinked and bent, with the slow, careful economy of a very old man, to retrieve the tablet from the floor, his expression already smoothing back into its usual placid, clinical calm. He did not, for even a fraction of a second, wonder why he'd dropped it. There was, after all, nothing left in his mind to wonder about. In a dim, flickering bar tucked behind a nondescript storefront on the far side of the city, Tamura Shigaraki had his boots up on a scarred wooden table and one hand scratching, absently, ceaselessly, at the side of his own neck. And once it's finally delivered, Kurogiri, I want it kept somewhere I can actually see it work, not locked up in some warehouse 3 prefectures away like everything else Sensei hands me. I've been waiting weeks. I want my new. He stopped mid-word. His hand, still raised to his neck, went utterly still. Something behind his pale, red-rimmed eyes flickered and dimmed, like a signal losing its carrier wave partway through a broadcast. And for one long, uncanny moment Tamura Shigaraki simply sat there, mouth still slightly open around a word that no longer had anything behind it to finish. Across the bar, the misting, formless shape known as Kurogiri, who had been in the middle of polishing a glass that would never once actually be used for a drink, an old habit from an old, half-remembered life he rarely spoke of, went strangely still as well, his dark, swirling form flickering at the edges the way a candle flickers in a sudden draft, dimming for just a moment before steadying back into its usual composed shape. Shigaraki. Kurogiri set the glass down, his voice carrying its usual careful, formal courtesy, though something in it had gone faintly uncertain. You were saying, you wanted your new? Shigaraki blinked. His hand resumed its restless scratching, unconsciously, the way it always did. My new what? Kurogiri paused, reached, with the patient thoroughness of a butler double-checking an appointment book, for whatever thread of conversation had just gone missing between them, and found, to his own quiet and immediate unease, nothing there at all. No memory of a project. No name. No DLVRY date. No promise. No toy waiting to be unwrapped. Only a faint, formless sense that something had very recently occupied that particular space in his thoughts, the way a room retains the shape of furniture that has just been carried out of it. I'm not certain, Kurogiri admitted, after a moment, in the same unfailingly polite tone he brought to everything. I believe I've lost the thread as well. Shigaraki scratched his neck a moment longer, shrugged with the particular petulance of a man who had decided a mystery wasn't worth the effort of solving, and reached instead for the remote to the small television mounted above the bar. Whatever. Wasn't important, probably. And in the space of a single afternoon, an entire 18-foot, months-in-the-making weapon of terror simply ceased in the only two minds that had ever wanted it to have existed at all. Far across the country, in a private, dimly lit room that few living people had ever been permitted to enter, a figure seated in the deep shadow of a high-backed chair felt a sharp, sudden pain lance behind his eyes, brief, precise, and gone again almost before it had fully registered. All for One did not move. He rarely did, these days, unless moving served some specific purpose. He sat with the same stillness he had cultivated across a lifetime measured in decades most men never lived to see, and let the pain pass through him the way he let most things pass through him. Patiently, without comment, cataloging it as a data point rather than a wound. Somewhere in the vast architecture of his memory, a memory built, quite literally, from the stolen fragments of 1,000 other lives, a single thread had simply gone dark. He could not have said, in that moment or any moment after, precisely what the thread had once connected to. He knew only, in the abstract and untroubled way a man might notice a single missing book from a library too vast to fully catalog, that something had been there, and now was not. He considered it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, finding nothing further to consider, he returned his attention to the reports awaiting him, and did not think of it again. None of it reached the corridor Huggy was currently tearing through, 3 kilometers away and 1 level underground. The violet blue wave had already come and gone through this facility's own foundations in its first silent, radiating instant, wiping clean whatever fragments of the project's blueprints and records had lived in its servers, deleting line after line of code in what one surviving technician would later describe, to no one who believed him, as a kind of digital suicide. Huggy felt none of it. He wasn't built from memory in the first place, not anymore. There was nothing left in him for the wave to take. He only felt the tunnel narrowing ahead of him, the recycled air growing thinner and more stale, and beneath all of it, a single, wordless, overriding need. Out. Need out. The corridor dead-ended at a massive ventilation, its grating bolted into old, corroding steel, and Huggy didn't slow down long enough to consider any option that wasn't immediate. His needle-sharp teeth, the second ring of them at the back of his throat flexing open in a way no human jaw ever could, closed around the grating's edge and tore it free with a shriek of tortured metal that echoed the length of the tunnel behind him. He didn't fit, not at first, not in any way a body built along ordinary lines ever could have. But his body wasn't built along ordinary lines at all. It was flexible, boneless in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a design meant to squeeze through spaces no living thing should ever have needed to pass through. And he folded himself into the narrow black throat of with a series of wet, unsettling contortions, his 18-foot frame compressing and twisting like a length of ribbon being threaded through a needle's eye. He climbed. He pushed. He scrambled, needle teeth and elastic fingers finding purchase in the dark where a human hand would have found only smooth, unyielding metal. And somewhere above him, faint and growing, he caught the first hint of something that was not recycled, sterile, underground air. It was sweet. It was fresh. It was, in a way he had no language yet to describe, vast. The smell of wet grass and cooling evening and a whole world he had never once, in the entirety of his brief existence, been permitted to smell before. Huggy Wuggy burst through the concealed exit of a maintenance shed on the quiet outskirts of Mizudafu, with all the grace of something being born a second time. He tumbled rather than emerged, long limbs sprawling loose and boneless across a wide stretch of cool grass, his momentum carrying him into an undignified heap that would have looked, to anyone watching, exactly like a discarded toy tipped carelessly from a box. He lay there for a long moment, chest rising and falling with breaths his new body didn't strictly need, but took anyway, some old and stubborn habit refusing to let go of itself even now. Slowly, Cautiously, the way a creature moves when it has never once, in its entire existence, had reason to trust a new environment. He pushed himself upright, folding his long legs beneath him, and looked around. His breath caught, somewhere deep in a chest that had no memory of ever catching its breath before. He was in a park, wide and quiet, dotted with sleeping trees and the pale shapes of empty benches, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable green space that exists in every city in the world and means nothing at all to the people who walk through it every day without a second glance. To Huggy, seeing it for the first time with eyes that had only ever known fluorescent light and steel walls, it might as well have been the whole of creation laid out at his feet. Above him, the sky was not a ceiling. That was the thought, if it could be called a thought, formless and wordless as it was, that struck him hardest of all, harder than the grass, harder than the trees, harder even than the strange, quiet relief of simply being able to move without a wall closing in on every side. There was no fluorescent buzz overhead. There was no flat, sterile white pressing down against the top of his skull. There was only a deep, endless indigo stretching out in every direction, soft at its lowest edges where the last color of sunset still clung on, deepening as it rose into a color with no bottom and no top, dusted here and there with the first faint, flickering points of the evening's earliest stars. Something in his chest, the massive, strange organ doing the work a human heart once did, slowed, for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in that ruined chamber. Not stopped, not calmed entirely, but slowed, the frantic, hammering panic of the last several hours easing, degree by degree, into something quieter. The wind moved through his fur, ruffling the thick, electric blue coat of it in slow, rolling waves, and he tilted his triangular head back to feel more of it, eyes half-litting in an expression that, on any other face, might have been mistaken for contentment. He didn't know who he was. He understood that much in the dim, instinctive way a creature understands hunger or cold, that there was a hollow space where a name and a history should have been, and that no amount of reaching into it produced anything at all. He didn't know where he'd come from, or what the room full of shouting men and small metal weapons had wanted from him, or why the walls behind him had smelled like fear and ozone while the world in front of him smelled like grass and rain and something else, something sweet, drifting from a row of flowering trees along the park's far edge. He knew almost nothing, but he was here. He was out, and above him, the sky went on forever, uninterrupted by a single wall. A leaf detached itself from the branch of a nearby tree, small, ordinary, spinning lazily down through the last of the evening light on some errant current of air, and drifted, unhurried, into the space just above Huggy's head. He watched it fall the way he had watched nothing else in his entire brief existence, with total, unguarded fascination, black eyes tracking its slow, tumbling path with the rapt attention of something that had never once been allowed the luxury of simple wonder. Slowly, carefully, he reached up one long, yellow-mittened hand, stretching it out further than any human arm should have been able to stretch, fingers spreading wide though they would never quite separate from one another, and closed it gently around the space where the leaf had been only a heartbeat earlier. His fingers met nothing but air. The leaf drifted past, unbothered, and settled at last in the grass a few feet away. He looked at his empty palm for a long moment. Then, undeterred, he reached for it again. Somewhere beyond the park's low iron fence, the ordinary hum of Mizutofu carried on entirely unaware of the 18-foot creature crouched quietly in its shadows. A silent, curious giant, alone under a sky he had never been meant to see, reaching, again and again, for something small and simple and just out of reach, in a world that had no earthly idea he existed at all. Night in the little park passed the way nights pass for something that has never once needed sleep and doesn't yet know how to ask for it. Huggy stayed where he'd landed for a long while, folded into the cool grass beneath the flowering trees, and simply watched. He watched the last color drain out of the sky and the stars come out one by one, faint and then bright, more of them than he had any framework to count. He watched a cat cross the far edge of the park with unhurried disdain for the 18-foot creature sitting perfectly still in the shadows, and something in him, some old, buried fragment of a boy who had once found every small living thing endlessly fascinating, watched it go with a quiet, wordless attention that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with simple wonder. He didn't sleep, not exactly. There was no tiredness in him to sleep away. But somewhere past midnight his body settled into something close to it anyway. A long, still quiet, muscles slack, eyes half-lidded, mind drifting in slow circles around the handful of impressions it had to work with. Grass, stars, the shape of a leaf falling, the sharp fear in 5 men's voices, the softer, warmer thing that had happened in his chest when the fear finally faded. Dawn came up gray and soft over Mizutofu, the last of an overnight drizzle beating on the grass around him. And it was the light, pale, growing, spilling color back into a world that had been all shadow for hours, that finally drew him back onto his feet. He found the construction yard almost by accident, wandering along the park's low iron fence until it gave way to a gap in a chain-link barrier, and beyond that, an open stretch of churned dirt and idle machinery where some half-finished building stood waiting for its next shift of workers to arrive. Nobody was there yet. It was early enough that the world still had that hushed, held-breath quality mornings sometimes have, before the first trains and the first DLVRY trucks and the first tired commuters start pulling the day into motion. And Huggy stood at the yard's edge with his head tilted so far back that his triangular chin pointed almost straight up at the sky, utterly transfixed. The world was blue. It matched his own fur, near enough, though this blue was somehow both paler and vaster than anything on his own body, stretching out in every direction with no wall to stop it, no ceiling to catch it, dotted here and there with slow, drifting shapes, the soft white of cotton candy that seemed to change form even as he watched them. He reached up one long, lanky arm, yellow mittened hand spreading wide, and closed his fingers gently around the empty air where one of the shapes seemed, from down here, close enough to touch. His fingers met nothing at all. The cloud, because that was what it was, some deep, unlearned corner of him supplied the word without explaining where it had come from, drifted on, unbothered, exactly the way the leaf had drifted past him the night before. He lowered his hand slowly. It wasn't disappointment, quite. It was something gentler than that, the simple, patient recalibration of a mind discovering one small failed reach at a time, the actual shape and rules of the world it now lived in. With a jerky, rolling sway, he began to move again. He stepped out of the yard's churned dirt and onto the hard, even concrete of the sidewalk beyond it, and the difference in the ground under his feet, solid, unforgiving, ringing very slightly with every footfall, seemed to fascinate him nearly as much as the sky had. His walk, from the very first steps he took on that sidewalk, was unlike anything the citizens of Mizutofu had ever seen before, and it would remain that way for the rest of his existence. He didn't have the smooth, economical gait of an ordinary body. His limbs were too long for that, too loosely hung, and every stride swung his arms and legs through wide, exaggerated arcs, his upper body staying strangely fluid and still even as his lower half lurched forward in a rolling, off-kilter rhythm. The unmistakable look, to anyone who happened to catch sight of it, of a giant sock puppet being worked by unseen strings from somewhere far overhead. Each footfall landed with a heavy, deliberate thump that traveled up through the pavement and rattled the nearest shop windows in their frames, the better part of a ton coming down again and again in a slow, steady, impossible-to-ignore cadence. The first person to see him properly was a man named Run Fujita, 46 years old, halfway through unloading a DLVRY of vegetables outside his produce stand, both arms full of a crate of daikon when he happened to glance up the block and simply stopped moving entirely. The crate hit the pavement. Half the daikon rolled loose into the gutter. Rin did not notice or care. "Monster!" His voice cracked on the word, high and raw, carrying the length of the block in the hushed quiet of early morning. "Is it a villain? Somebody call the pros. Call the hero hotline now." The street, which had been sleepy and half-empty a moment earlier, came apart all at once. A woman walking her dog yanked the leash so hard the little terrier yelped, scooping the animal up bodily and bolting for the nearest doorway. Two schoolboys on bicycles swerved so violently they nearly collided with each other, one of them dropping his bike entirely and simply running, backpack still bouncing against his shoulders. An elderly man leaning on a cane in front of a shuttered bakery pressed himself flat against the storefront glass. One trembling hand fumbling for a phone, he clearly had no idea how to operate quickly enough. "Is it a mutation?" Someone shouted from a second-floor window, already halfway through slamming it shut. "It looks like, is that fur? Since when do villains have fur?" "I don't care what it looks like, get inside, get inside." Shop grates began rattling down all along the block in a ragged, panicked chorus, one after another, storefronts going dark and locked in the space of a single minute. A mother dragged her two children bodily through her own front door, one child still clutching an unfinished breakfast pastry, both of them craning their necks for one more terrified look at the towering blue shape lumbering down the middle of the street. Huggy stopped. He stopped the instant the screaming started, froze mid-stride, one long arm still half raised from its swing, his head tilting first one way and then the other, black eyes tracking the scattering, fleeing shapes with an expression of open, uncomprehending confusion. He saw small, pale figures running, their faces twisted into something he recognized, on some deep and wordless level, as afraid. The same shape of feeling he'd felt himself, not 12 hours earlier, in a room full of shouting men. He didn't understand why they were afraid of him. He raised one massive yellow hand, slowly, gently, the exact same friendly, unhurried wave a much smaller, much more ordinary boy might once have given a neighbor across a schoolyard, and offered it to the fleeing street at large. It made everything worse. "It's waving at us." Rin Fujita's voice, from behind an overturned vegetable crate, hit a register that hadn't been part of his vocal range since adolescence. "Oh God, it's waving. Why is it waving?" Huggy's head tilted further, a small, wordless confusion blooming somewhere behind his permanent smile. Why are they making the loud, sharp noises? The thought arrived without language, more feeling than sentence. But the shape of the question was clear enough even to the creature having it. "Is it a game? Is this how the small ones play?" He lowered his hand slowly, some instinct telling him, even without being able to name it, that whatever this was, it was not a game, and continued down the street at his same rolling, jerking pace, arms swinging loose at his sides, leaving a trail of slammed doors and rattling shop grates behind him. The intersection at the end of the block was busier, a real crossroads, for lanes of morning traffic already thickening with the first wave of commuters, a bus idling at a covered stop, a handful of pedestrians clustered at the corner waiting for the signal to change. None of them had heard the screaming 2 blocks back yet. It hadn't had time to travel that far. Among the small crowd at the corner stood a woman named Yuki Tanaka, 31, juggling a phone against one ear and a folder of paperwork under the opposite arm, half a step behind her daughter, who was 5 years old and profoundly uninterested in traffic signals when there was a bright red RBB ball to chase. "Hannah, honey, stay close to Mommy," Yuki said, distracted, phone still pressed to her ear. "We'll cross when the light." The ball got away from Hannah's fingers on a bad bounce, skittering off the curb and rolling, with the particular malicious timing ball seemed to reserve for exactly this situation, directly out into the crossing lane. "Hannah, wait." But Hannah was already moving, 5 years old and utterly fearless in the specific way small children are fearless about the one thing that should terrify them most, darting off the curb after her ball with her whole small body focused on nothing else in the world. The DLVRY truck came around the corner a half-second later. An ordinary morning DLVRY run. An ordinary tired driver, named Kenji Oda, running 20 minutes behind schedule and not expecting, on an intersection he'd cleared 1,000 mornings before without incident, to see a small red-jacketed shape suddenly dart directly into his lane. He saw her at the very last possible instant. His whole body reacted before his mind had fully processed what his eyes had shown him. Both feet slamming the brake pedal to the floor, the truck's tires locking and shrieking against pavement still slick from the overnight rain. And finding, in that same terrible half-second, absolutely no purchase at all. The truck didn't slow so much as it simply skidded, tires screaming a long, helpless note across wet asphalt, its heavy front grille bearing down on a small girl who had frozen. Finally, ball forgotten, eyes going wide with the first flicker of real understanding. "Hannah!" Yuki's phone hit the pavement. Her scream tore out of her raw and wordless, both hands flying out as if distance alone could somehow reach across the lane and pull her daughter back. Hannah, no. Every pedestrian at that corner would later describe what happened next slightly differently. The mind does strange things to a memory it can't quite make sense of, but every single account agreed on one detail. It happened too fast to properly see. Something in Huggy's chest had been building since the moment he rounded the corner behind them. A low, rising pressure that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with some deep, wordless alarm system that had never once in his brief existence had caused to activate before. It didn't tingle. It didn't warn gently. It roared an urgent, total body certainty that something terrible was about to happen and that there was right now, in this exact half-second, still time to stop it. Something deep beneath even that. A small, guttering ember that had survived a soul infuser's total annihilation of everything else he'd ever been. Ignited all at once, bright and total and absolute. He moved. It wasn't a run, not in any sense a human body could have managed. It was closer to a discharge. Every ounce of kinetic speed his stolen biology had ever been built to hold combining in a single instant with the explosive, coiled power of legs bred for nothing but closing distance in the blink of an eye. To the pedestrians frozen at that corner, Huggy Wuggy did not run toward the little girl in the street. He simply stopped being where he had been and started being somewhere else, a blur of electric blue that seemed, for one impossible half-second, to bend the very air around it, close enough to the sound barrier that a low, rolling crack of displaced pressure followed a full beat behind him like delayed thunder. Hannah had just enough time to squeeze her eyes shut, small body brace for an impact that every terrified adult around her was certain was coming. It never came. What came instead was warm, astonishingly warm, and soft in a way that had nothing to do with the hard, cold shape of a truck's grill. Soft like the inside of a favorite stuffed animal, soft like the world's largest, gentlest blanket, carrying with it a strange, unplaceable scent of cinnamon and something like the smell of a toy fresh out of its box. Hannah opened her eyes. She was 3 feet off the ground, cradled against something impossibly large and impossibly gentle. 2 massive yellow-mittened hands cupped around her small body with a delicacy that seemed almost absurd given their size. The same careful, exact pressure a person might use to hold something made of spun glass. She looked up, craning her small neck back and back and back, and found herself staring into a face that took up half the sky. A wide triangular head, a permanent grin stretched red-lipped from ear to ear, and 2 enormous black eyes that, up close, weren't cold or empty at all. They were soft. They were watching her with an expression she recognized instantly. The way children recognize kindness long before they have words for it. The exact same look her own mother gave her at bedtime. "Thank you," Hannah said, in the clear, uncomplicated voice of someone who has just been rescued and finds the whole experience mostly delightful. "You're really soft." Something in Huggy's chest, the vast, strange organ that had taken over a human heart's old job, swelled with a warmth so sudden and total it nearly staggered him where he stood. He didn't have words. He would never have words, not the spoken kind, not for the rest of his existence. But he had this, and it was enough. He lowered her, with the same exquisite care he'd caught her, onto the safety of the far sidewalk, and then, because some ancient, unbreakable instinct in him simply demanded it, he curled his long, lanky arms gently around her in a full, towering embrace, careful never to press with anything close to his real strength, his enormous frame folding down and around her like a blue velvet curtain. Hannah giggled, delighted, and buried her face happily in his fur. The truck had finally shuddered to a full stop nearly 30 feet past where Hannah had been standing. Its driver slumped over the wheel, both hands shaking, breath coming in short, disbelieving gasps. "Oh God," Kenji Oda kept saying, to no one, to the windshield, to whatever higher power had apparently decided he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life as the man who'd killed a 5-year-old on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Oh God, I couldn't stop. The road was wet. I couldn't." Yuki Tanaka was already running, her paperwork forgotten on the pavement behind her, tears streaming freely down her face as she half collapsed to her knees in front of the towering blue creature still curled protectively around her daughter. Hannah, baby, are you?" Her hands hovered, shaking, not quite sure whether it was safe to reach for her own child through 18 feet of unfamiliar fur, until Huggy, with a gentleness that made the whole watching street go very quiet, unfolded his arms and stepped back, offering the girl up like something precious being returned rather than something merely released. Hannah ran straight into her mother's arms, and Yuki gathered her up and simply held on, sobbing openly now, and it was into that raw, unguarded silence that the first sound of clapping broke. It was tentative at first, one person somewhere near the back of the gathered crowd, a single pair of hands coming together almost experimentally, as if testing whether the moment could actually hold the weight of celebration. Then another joined it, then three more. Within the space of perhaps 10 seconds, the same street that had been screaming monster 2 blocks back had turned itself, entirely and without any further debate, into something closer to a stadium. "Did you see that?" Someone shouted, phone already raised, filming. "It moved faster than All Might. I swear to God. Blue Beast. Blue Beast." A teenager near the bus stop had started chanting, half joking, and the chant caught in the way these things sometimes do, spreading from person to person until a good third of the gathered crowd had picked it up, laughing now, delighted, the fear of 10 minutes earlier entirely forgotten in the face of an 18-foot creature that had just moved faster than the eye could track to save a little girl's life and then, having done so, immediately hugged her. Huggy stood in the middle of all of it, arms loose at his sides, head tilting slowly from one cheering face to the next, utterly bewildered by the sudden and total reversal of the fear he'd been trying, without success, to understand only minutes earlier. The heavy weight hit the pavement 30 feet away with enough force to crack the concrete in a small, radiating starburst, and a voice like a foghorn built entirely out of confidence rolled down the street ahead of the dust. "Ha ha ha! Fear not, citizens. Why? Because I am." All Might froze mid-declaration, golden hair still settling from his landing, both fists still raised in his signature pose, and found himself, for possibly the first time in his entire professional career, looking not down at the scene he'd just arrived to save, but up, way up. He had to crane his neck back nearly as far as it would go to find the face of the towering blue creature currently standing in the middle of a cheering crowd. One massive hand still lifted in an uncertain half-wave at the small girl, now safely bundled in her sobbing mother's arms. "It's All Might." The crowd's attention swung, immediate and total, toward the golden hero, and All Might, to his eternal professional credit, recovered his composure in something close to half a second flat, clearing his throat with a sound like a small engine turning over. "Ahem. Yes, I am here." His trademark grin found its footing again, though something behind his eyes had not stopped calculating since the moment he'd looked up. "And it seems—" His gaze swept the scene, the cracked but empty street, the truck still idling with its shaken driver, the little girl entirely unharmed, and the 18-foot creature standing at the center of it all, radiating nothing but confused, gentle warmth. "It seems I was nearly outstaged. Ha ha ha." The crowd laughed, delighted, phones still raised, and All Might let the laugh land and settle before he turned his full attention. Genuine, focused, unmistakably serious beneath the showman's grin, toward the creature still standing patiently amid the wreckage of its own rescue. "Young tall man," he said, pitching his voice to carry without quite matching the earlier boom. "That display just now, I saw the tail end of it from 3 blocks over, and I have never in all my years seen anyone move like that. Might I ask you to come with me for a moment? I believe you and I have some matters to discuss." Huggy tilted his head at the golden light, at the warm, booming, unmistakably kind voice. The same voice, some deep, unlearned part of him registered, that had once, in an alley he had no memory of, told a frightened, dying boy, "I'm sorry, but it's the truth." And though nothing of that memory survived in him now, some fainter echo of it seemed to recognize the shape of the man standing in front of him regardless. He gave a slow, enthusiastic nod, one massive yellow hand rising in something that looked, unmistakably, like agreement. The crowd's cheering rose up again behind them, warm and unbroken, as All Might turned to lead the way toward a quieter side street where 2 entirely different kinds of symbol. One built on 10,000 hours of relentless training, one built on stolen quirks and a soul that had lost every memory except the instinct to protect, were about to have their very first real conversation. The alley All Might led him to was narrow, wedged between the blank brickbacks of two office buildings, quiet in a way that felt almost startling after the noise of the street they'd just left. The cheering still carried faintly from around the corner. Someone was still chanting Blue Beast with the stubborn enthusiasm of a crowd that had decided, collectively, that this was the best thing that had happened to their Tuesday morning. But here, in the shadow between the buildings, it faded down to something distant and muffled, easy to set aside. All Might exhaled once he judged them far enough from prying eyes, a long breath that seemed to cost him something, and pressed the back of one enormous gloved hand briefly to his mouth. It came away clean this time. Small mercies. 20 minutes, he thought, doing the same private, constant arithmetic he did every hour of every day, an internal clock that never stopped ticking down no matter how badly he wished it would. Maybe 25, if I don't push. I've already spent more of today's window on that villain today than I planned to. This had better be worth the rest of it. He looked up and up and up at the creature currently folding itself down into an approximate crouch beside a row of rusted dumpsters, trying with visible and touching effort to make itself smaller so as not to loom quite so completely over the conversation they were about to have. It didn't fully work. Even hunched nearly double, Huggy Wuggy's head remained a good 4 feet above All Might's own, black eyes fixed on him with an attention that was unnervingly total, unblinking, patient. All right, Toshinori, he told himself, one thing at a time. Listen, young man, he began, and let some of the showman's boom drain out of his voice, replacing it with something quieter, steadier. The register he used for civilians in shock, for children separated from their parents, for exactly this kind of moment when volume would only make things worse. I saw what you did back there. Truly, that was, I don't say this lightly, one of the more remarkable rescues I've witnessed in a very long career. You didn't hesitate. Not for a second. That matters, and I want you to understand I'm not here to scold you for it. Huggy's head tilted a few degrees, taking this in with the particular stillness of a creature listening far more carefully to tone than to words, the way a dog reads a room before it ever learns the meaning of a single command. The permanent ear-to-ear grin gave nothing away, the same fixed shape it would always hold no matter what passed behind it. But the eyes, All Might noticed, tracked his face with real, searching intensity, pupils contracting and dilating in small, restless adjustments, as though the creature were trying, quite literally, to read him. But All Might continued, and here the weight in his voice deepened. There's something you need to understand about how the world works now, and I suspect, from everything I've seen in the last 10 minutes, that you genuinely don't know it yet. Using a quirk in public for heroic work, without a license, that's not simply frowned upon. It's illegal. The police could take you in for it, whether or not what you did was, in every sense that matters, exactly right. Illegal. The word landed somewhere in the wordless dark of Huggy's mind and found nothing there to catch on. It wasn't fear, exactly, that rippled through him at the sound of it. More a kind of formless unease, the same unease he'd felt facing down 5 armed men in a room that smelled like ozone, the memory of which existed in him now only as a texture, a residue, with no images or names attached. He understood the police could take you and had teeth to it, even without understanding precisely what a policeman was. He thought, without words, about the little girl, about the warm, delighted sound of her laugh against his fur. He didn't understand how something that had felt so simply, obviously right, could also be the kind of thing that got a person taken away. A thought bubble might as well have hovered visibly over his head, so plainly did the confusion sit in every line of his enormous frame. What is illegal? What is a quirk? He looked down at his own yellow, mitten-shaped hands, turning them slowly, as if the answer might be written somewhere on his own palms if he simply looked hard enough. Then he looked back up at Toshinori, and the expression he wore, insofar as a face built with only one permanent expression could be said to wear anything at all, was one of pure, blank, searching confusion. You don't know what a quirk is, All Might said, very slowly, watching the creature's face for any flicker of recognition and finding none. It wasn't quite a question. It had started as one and ended somewhere closer to a private, dawning alarm. Huggy shook his head. Slow, deliberate. Honest, in the uncomplicated way that only something entirely without guile can be honest. All Might filed that away, carefully, the way he'd learned over 27 years of hero work to file away any single fact that didn't fit the shape of the world as he understood it, because those were always, eventually, the facts that mattered most. Can you talk? He tried instead, softer now. Another shake of the head, slower this time, and something in it, some small, private sorrow buried in the motion, made All Might's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. Right. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing briefly up and down the empty alley as though the solution might be waiting there among the trash cans. Okay, let's try something simpler then. What's your name? Young man, can you tell me that much, one way or another? Huggy's eyes moved. It was the first genuinely purposeful motion All Might had seen from him since the crowd had scattered. A sharp, searching sweep of the alley's cluttered ground, dark pupils flicking from a stack of collapsed cardboard to a rusted downspout to, finally, a sodden flyer half-plastered against the wet brick a few feet away, its ink smeared but still legible. Grand reopening. Muzutafu Traveling Circus. The words wrapped around a faded cartoon elephant balancing on a striped ball. Beside it, half buried in the overflow of a tipped garbage bin, the dull glint of a cheap promotional ballpoint pen. The kind a bank hands out for free at the counter, most of its ink long since dried to uselessness, but not, as it turned out, all of it. Huggy's long arm unfolded toward both objects with a fluid, boneless economy that made All Might's eyebrows climb. The limb stretching further than any human arm had any right to, elastic and unhurried, snatching up flyer and pen together between fingers that were, for all practical purposes, fused solid inside their yellow Velcro-lined mittens. All Might watched, fascinated despite himself, as the creature turned the pen over once in its grip, adjusting, testing the angle, the pressure, the fit of an object clearly never designed to be held by anything remotely like this hand, until it found a way to pin the barrel between its single mobile thumb and the broad, flat side of its palm. It shouldn't have worked. By every reasonable expectation All Might could summon, it should have been like watching a bear attempt embroidery. It worked anyway. Huggy bent low over the flyer, tongue tip, a detail that struck All Might as oddly, achingly human, a small unconscious habit surviving in a body that otherwise resembled nothing human at all. Poking out very slightly in concentration, and began to write. The letters that emerged were not clumsy. They were not the shaky, effortful print of someone fighting their own hands for control. They were neat, careful, almost elegant, each character formed with the unhurried precision of someone who had, at some point in some life this creature no longer had, any access to clearly practiced penmanship a great deal. The specific, deliberate neatness of a person accustomed to writing things down so they would still be legible and useful weeks later, filed away for a purpose only they understood. He held the flyer out. Huggy Wuggy, it read, in handwriting that looked almost comically refined set against the monstrous yellow mitten that had produced it. All Might took the flyer with careful fingers, read the two words twice, and felt something in the back of his mind, some small, insistent tug, formless and immediate and gone again almost before he could catch hold of it, the vague, weightless sensation of a word landing somewhere it had already, somehow, half expected to land. He couldn't place it. He set it aside as nothing, the way exhausted minds set aside 1,000 small nothings every day, and focused instead on the plain fact in front of him. Huggy Wuggy, he said it aloud, testing the shape of it, and found, to his own faint surprise, that he didn't dislike it. A bit unusual, though I'll be honest with you, son, in this line of work I've heard considerably stranger. There's a villain 2 districts over who goes by Mr. Compress. Another fellow insists on being called twice, spelled with a number, which took me an embarrassingly long while to work out the first time I saw it written down. He offered this with a small, genuine laugh, hoping it might ease some of the tension he could still see coiled through the creature's enormous frame. Huggy Wuggy. All right, I'll take it. Huggy's shoulders, if they could be called shoulders, the point where his impossibly long arms folded into the rest of him, seemed to loosen very slightly at that, some small fraction of relief passing through him at having been understood, however imperfectly, for the first time since he'd woken up in a world with no memory attached to it at all. All Might studied him a moment longer, turning over the next, more pressing question in his mind before he asked it. "Tell me something, young Huggy." He gestured, an open, encompassing wave of his hand, taking in the whole towering, blue-furred, impossible shape of him. "Is your appearance itself your quirk? I've encountered a handful of permanent transformation types over the years. Gigantification mutations, mostly, though none that ran quite this far past the ordinary human silhouette. Is that what this is? A mutation you were simply born with, that never quite settled back down to a human shape?" Huggy stared at him. The question landed and found, once again, absolutely nothing to catch on. No framework, no vocabulary, not even the faint, half-familiar tug the name had produced a moment earlier. He understood, "Is this your?" And he understood, dimly, the shape of a question being asked of him, but the middle of the sentence, quirk, mutation, dissolved the instant it reached whatever remained of the mind trying to process it, the way a hand passes through smoke. He took the flyer back with careful fingers, flipped it to a cleaner corner, and wrote again, slower this time, the pen pressing a little harder into the paper, as though the effort of forming a question rather than simply a name required something more of him. He held it out. "What's a quirk?" All Might read the 3 words once, read them a second time, certain, for one full and irrational second, that he'd simply misread the creature's handwriting. He hadn't. His voice, when it finally came, had lost every trace of its performative boom, dropped down to something low and genuinely unsteady, a register All Might almost never allowed the public to hear from him. "You don't know? You don't know what a quirk is?" Huggy tilted his head, innocent and patient, and shook it slowly. "No." All Might's mind, the same mind that had spent 27 years cataloging villains, calculating threat levels, running through 1,000 worst-case scenarios in the half-second before every fight, simply stalled out entirely for a moment, the way an engine stalls when asked to run on fuel it was never built to burn. 80%, he thought, and the thought arrived in fragments, disordered, refusing to line up neatly the way his thoughts almost always did. 80% of the population has one. It's the first thing a child learns about the world, practically before they learn their own name. It's on every news broadcast, every school curriculum, every product label with a quirk compatibility warning stamped across it. There is no possible way to exist in this country, in this era, and not know the single most basic organizing fact of the world you're standing in. "The truck," he said aloud, almost to himself, GRPNG for some external proof against the impossible thing in front of him. "This morning, the little girl. You moved faster than the eye could track. You generated enough force to stop a 2-ton vehicle's momentum without so much as staggering. That's not nothing, son. That's not ordinary. Surely you must have some sense of where that speed came from, some understanding of your own." Huggy only tilted his head the other way, and shook it again, slow and honest and utterly without guile. Whatever had let him move that fast, whatever had let him fold himself through a ventilation no human body should have fit through, whatever strange arithmetic of stolen strength lived somewhere in his BLD, none of it had arrived with so much as a whisper of explanation attached. It simply was, the way breathing simply was, a fact of his existence with no accompanying instruction manual. Toshinori Yagi felt, for the first time and longer than he cared to admit, a cold sweat prickle along the back of his neck that had nothing to do with his injuries. No memory of quirks. No knowledge of the world at all. Near as I can tell. Not even the most basic scaffolding a child builds their entire understanding of society around. And yet, he looked again at the flyer in his hand, at the small, careful, unmistakably practiced handwriting. And yet the motor control to write like that, with hands built for nothing of the kind. And yet the instinct, not calculation, instinct immediate and total. To put himself between a truck and a child he'd never met before in his life, without 1/2 second of hesitation. "What in the world are you?" He became abruptly, uncomfortably aware that he was still staring, and that the creature in front of him, this vast, strange, gentle, terrifyingly powerful thing that apparently understood less about its own existence than a 4-year-old child, was simply waiting, patient and unbothered, for whatever came next. There was no fear in that waiting, no calculation, No hidden agenda that All Might's decades of instinct could detect anywhere in the wide, black, watching eyes. Only a kind of open, trusting stillness that made the whole situation feel, somehow, even more unsettling than if the creature had shown him teeth. This isn't a villain, he thought, with sudden and complete certainty, the same bone-deep instinct that had never once steered him wrong across an entire career of reading threats correctly in the half-second before it mattered. Whatever this is, however it came to be, whatever unnatural process built a body like this, there is no malice in it. None. I would stake everything I have left on that. But that doesn't make it safe. And it doesn't make it simple. And it most certainly doesn't tell me what I'm supposed to do with it standing in an alleyway with no name, no memory, no understanding of quirks, and enough raw power in that frame to level a city block by accident. He became aware, distantly, of the clock still ticking down inside his own chest. 15 minutes now, maybe less, the golden bulk of his hero form already beginning to feel, in the specific way only he could ever feel it, like borrowed time running thin. There wasn't room left in today's window to solve this alone. There wasn't room, if he was honest with himself, in a decade of solving things alone to make sense of something this far outside every category he'd ever built his understanding of the world around. There was exactly one person in Japan All Might trusted to look at an impossible thing and see, underneath the impossibility, the actual shape of the problem. "I need to get you to UA," he said, mostly to himself, turning the flyer over once more in his hand, as though the answer might yet be hiding somewhere on its damp, ink-smeared surface. "Principal Nizu, he's the only one I know who could possibly make sense of you. If there's an answer to any of this, young Huggy, he's the one who'll find it." Huggy watched him say it, head tilting at the new and unfamiliar shape of the word Nizu, understanding nothing of what it meant and everything, somehow, of the tone it was said in, the particular blend of urgency and something almost like hope that colored the golden hero's voice as he said it. Whatever came next, some small and wordless part of Huggy Wuggy decided, watching the tired lines gather at the corners of a hero's impossibly bright smile. He would go along with it. There was nothing else, after all, that he currently understood well enough to do instead. All Might straightened, tucked the sodden flyer carefully into a pouch at his belt. A small, precise gesture, the gesture of a man filing away evidence rather than discarding trash, and gestured toward the alley's mouth, toward the wider street beyond it where an oversized, aging pickup truck sat parked at an angle that suggested its owner hadn't much cared, this morning, about anything so mundane as proper parking etiquette. "Come on, then," he said, and something of his old, booming warmth had crept back into his voice despite everything, some stubborn refusal in him to let even a mystery this large entirely extinguish it. "Let's see about getting you somewhere a bit less likely to end with the both of us explaining ourselves to the police." This marks the end of part 1 of What If Deku Was Trapped Inside Poppy Playtime. A big thanks to Mr. Wonder King 12 for granting the permission to feature this amazing fanfiction. Please like the video and subscribe to Deku Universe for more interesting stories. Thank you, and see you soon.